clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Trade, Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership Bill, Lords, not amended in Public Bill Committee, to be considered.
Now.
We will begin with new clause 1, with which it will be convenient to consider other selected new clauses and amendments as listed on the selection paper, and I call Sir Iain Duncan Smith to move new clause 1.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's a pleasure to rise and speak to this particular amendment, which is signed by a cross-party group of MPs who all believe that Parliament should have the right to scrutinise trade deals. So, the purpose of this amendment seeks to ensure appropriate parliamentary scrutiny of the UK's position towards the accession of economies that are designated, and it's very specific this, as threats or systemic challenges. And the amendment would achieve two things. First, the government would be required to produce a report assessing the impact on the economy's accession on the UK, and both Houses of Parliament would have a non-binding vote on the UK's position regarding the accession of the economy in question. So, in other words, it would be taking the temperature of Parliament's view, even if it disagrees with the government. And I think that would be important because the public needs to know. So we shouldn't be frightened of this. Yeah, indeed.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for his amendment and for taking the time to introduce this. Some of us have been arguing for parliamentary scrutiny on trade deals for the last 4 years, and there is a mechanism under the form of the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act. Is that not the better vehicle because it was already passed, which also offers the vote, theoretically, for us to be able to scrutinise our trade deals?
I'll come to that in a minute because it doesn't, and that's the whole point of this particular amendment. So in the 2023 Integrated Review Refresh, the countries that were defined as threats were Russia, Iran and North Korea, while China was designated a systemic challenge. The wording of this amendment does not directly mention China, but the eligible countries under the current integrated review, China is the only economy which has applied to join. And they haven't just applied to join, but they are theoretically next on the list to go into the CTTPP. Indeed.
I completely understand the point that the honourable gentleman is trying to make. But one of the interesting things about being a member of CPTPP is that you then have a power of veto as a member. So that gives us quite a lot of strength about potentially preventing China from joining.
Well, I enjoy the idea that my honourable friend puts such trust in government that they will never take consideration of other arrangements. We know how that works. It may not be fine today with this particular minister, my right honourable friend, but there may be others in charge, and I'm not sure I would always want to rest my defence in the ministerial side, where there are often errors to play. I give way.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way, and indeed for this amendment. Was he as surprised as I was when we put the question to the Secretary of State about whether she would block China's accession to CPTPP, and she was unable to give us an unequivocal answer?
I think the honourable gentleman makes my point, which is you can't always... I mean, I sat in government, and all I can say to you is you can't always say that ministers will necessarily do the right thing, but the right thing by the government, which sometimes is not the same. I don't mean to cast aspersions by any means on my government, but that has happened in the past. So I simply want to make the point that the China's potential accession it has huge implications for all sorts of things, including its immense economic and political influence in the region and the pressures on the UK if the UK was almost isolated in its observance. So we know that China's accession, and there may be others that are rather like China as well, is not a like-minded party. It openly seeks to revise the liberal, open and rules-based order and establish itself as a regional hegemon. If admitted, it would be the largest economy and dominant economic and trading partner with unrivalled political influence, and it could block a future US entry, which is very important for us as we go in to make way and certainly bring the US in, which will help on a whole range of areas. And that would help cement Beijing's desired leadership in global trade. I remind the House they are next up for that. So this is not something conjured up in the near future. And it was also, I say, that China's entry also risked further increasing economic dependence, which is already too high, and building resilience into the Chinese economy to weather sanctioning should tensions over Taiwan escalate, which they're almost certain to do. And this would run counter to the UK's strategic efforts to de-risk and maintain status quo in the region. Serious human rights abuses are and continue to be embedded within the Chinese supply chains. They are the most egregious offender in this regard on religion in Xinjiang, also in Tibet. Slave labour is practiced. So this is the question. And slave labour undercuts the WTO and undercuts normal trade. So these are other good commercial reasons why anybody having those views, which China happens to do, would actually have a real impact on their membership. So China's accession is unlikely to drive economic reform in the country, and there's no political ability to drive such reform under the existing President Xi, who has moved China further away from the spirit of the CPTPP on labour rights protective, the point I was making. Thank you.
I thank my right honourable friend. Having just returned from leading a parliamentary delegation to Lithuania, my right honourable friend was talked about by many Lithuanian politicians about the leading role he is taking about warning Western democracies about the conduct of the Chinese Communist government. Will he agree with me that Lithuania is a very interesting case in point for us to study and perhaps learn from in how a European country confronts and takes on the increasing nefarious conduct of the Chinese Communist Party?
I thank my honourable friend. It's always very kind to be referred to in another country, and leads me to wonder whether I shouldn't be standing there. But the real point is that his own, no encouragement from the other side, thank you very much. But I do say to him, he's quite right. Lithuania is a tiny country, but they have rather bravely recognised Taiwan, and they have come under the cosh from China as a result. So I want to move back to my points here, please. So thank him for that intervention. So it's not a pipe dream. As I said earlier on, China is already applied to join the CPTPP on the 16th of September 2021 and is next in line. It's widely reported that Beijing is now lobbying already hard for membership, and that countries previously opposed have now softened their line. Australia has been doing this for reasons that we know, because, of course, they've had trade problems. And it's widely reported that Beijing, having done that, and all that's required for Chinese accession is for other members to permit it. The current labour regulations would seem to preclude China's accession, but the risk is there, and we shouldn't take it. An actor-agnostic approach, rather than naming any specific actor, linking to the integrated review, also enables the government to create a threshold which is reflective to developments rather than static, meaning that the report, debate and vote is only required where the integrated review has designated those specific economies as threats or systematic challenges. Weak language in its own right, but nonetheless it's in the review. So the CRAG process, I just want to deal with this quickly. The amendment is in line with the government policy, but exposes a loophole through the CRAG process. There's currently no provision for a debate and non-binding vote for future accession to plurilateral trade agreements. The constitutional reform and governance process would not require the government to produce an impact report on China's accession to the CPTPP, neither would it provide for a parliamentary debate or vote. And given the long-term significance to the UK of being in a plurilateral trade agreement where the biggest partner is China, it is appropriate for Parliament to be furnished with an up-to-date, accurate report and to have the opportunity to consider the matter. After all, I have no other reason as to why we're here if we are not allowed to discuss such important matters. I give way.
He's making, thank you very much. He's making a very good point about some of the weaknesses of CRAG and the needing to strengthen it, particularly around when either accession or other material changes happen to a treaty that we're already a member of. The Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, which I sit on, have published a report which outlines some of the changes to the way that government operates under CRAG. And would he, with me, agree that we need to change it so that significant changes to treaties and accession should always automatically be a report and potential vote in this House? Otherwise, we sign ourselves up to things we don't know what come down further on along the line.
I'm grateful for that intervention. I agree with him. And I wasn't so certain about this, so I looked at what Lord Lisvane, one time Chief Clerk here in the House, said about this. And I want to quote him because he produced a note on this. He said, "The issue, as I recall, was whether motion to approve PRC's accession could be amended. Commons SO number 24B says that when a motion in neutral terms, in the judgment of the Chair, is tabled, no amendments to it may be tabled." And I think this would probably rule out seeking to amend simply take note debates or has a considered the motion. And I want to emphasise that it is not true that a motion to take note can be amended, which was used in the other place as a defence. And the CRAG process does not provide for a vote, doesn't even guarantee a debate, and this is why this amendment, I think, is needed. So the UK trade policy is not unusual for bilateral trade agreements to be subject to parliamentary approval. Free trade agreements are routinely subject to parliamentary approval. In response to criticism of the CRAG process in 2021, the Grimston rule was established, whereas the government has agreed in principle to allow time to debate prospective FTAs, where the International Agreements Committee has published a report. I happen to believe that there are ministers who are very keen and happy to have debates. I say no names in this particular area, but I do say that that is the case. I know, however, that the Foreign Office absolutely opposes it because they hate to have any serious debates about their prerogative. I give way.
Yeah.
I'm pleased the right honourable gentleman is keen on debates. On that basis, could I invite him to sign my prayer against this treaty, so at least we could urge the government then to give us a debate on the treaty itself as a whole?
I ask him not to tempt me beyond the amendment that I'm making. I'm always happy to look at this, and I do believe in debate. It's absolutely vital, otherwise governments never get held to account. So it's important to emphasise that once the Trade CTP bill is passed, the CRAG process, therefore, I don't believe, and I don't believe those who know, cannot be applied in future accessions. And I'm aware it's against long-standing UK policy to tie government's hands on trade, and that's why the vote provided for the amendment is not binding. That allows the debate, allows the government to take note of that debate and in due course maybe change it. So Article 30.4 of the CTPPP agreement explicitly provides that accession may be, and I quote, subject to the applicable legal procedures of each party and according an exceeding state or separate customs territory, and that's an accession candidate. The UK's procedures already allow for some parliamentary scrutiny. There's no legal base to argue that enhanced scrutiny would impact the UK's accession. And I also say that the UK is not alone. Other governments have spoken freely in the past about their opposition, in particular key UK allies. Japan and Australia. Australia had stated it would not endorse China's application, while Beijing continues to block the import of Australian goods, including wine and barley, and that is a matter for them to debate at the moment. But Canada also, Japan and New Zealand, in condemning China's economic coercion, despite there's a little softening in their line, they're still warning there was no chance China would join in the near term. Japan, a country that has been most astute in dealing with China economically, continues to see China's application as fundamentally geopolitical. And I want to quote from their report, China is far removed from the free, fair and highly transparent world of the TPP. The chances that it can join are close to zero, and that was Japan's State Minister of Finance, and that China's application can be thought of as a move to prevent Taiwan from joining, who, by the way, is second up. And bear in mind also, I want to make a point for those who don't know, it isn't about national countries, it's about economies, and that's why Taiwan can bid to join the CTPPP, even if their status as a nation is not recognised by everybody. I give very briefly, because
I'm grateful again to my right honourable friend. I hope he will come on when he is very well highlighting the various concerns about the conduct of China and why they shouldn't join the CPTPP. But will he also come on and agree with me that the conduct of the Chinese government in the South China Sea, stealing hundreds of atolls from Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia and others, is a waterway through which 60% of the world's trade passes through, is also a cause for concern?
It is. I must ask my honourable friend, I can't follow him down Lithuania and the atolls in the Far East, because I think I'll be out of order from the chair, so forgive me, he makes a very strong point. I do say gently to the opposition spokesman, Labour introduced the amendment in the Lords and Committee, Lord Lyon. Labour said they would whip for the amendment if it were reworked to not mention China, and the new amendment, strangely, doesn't mention China in its actual terms, so I would hope that they would have supported this, but they haven't, and that's them to, they've got their own amendment down, I understand that. So Parliament should be able to make its voice heard on a matter of such national significance. The amendment does not overturn constitutional conventions by a long way. A report, debate and a non-binding vote would not determine government policy, but would determine the House's view on the particular elements of that particular trade deal. And I note that new clause 4, tabled by the opposition, as I said earlier on, will actually also seek to look at this as well. But there are other issues, and I won't bring them up now. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think it's quite right. I think there are elements in the government that believe that debate is not a bad thing, because it allows you to make your case anyway as to why such a trade deal is important. I would urge the government to be positive about this, because being positive about debate in the House of Commons is a restatement of democracy, and it allows people to decide whether or not they agree with this, and more importantly, because this is about accession, that those who might accede to the treaty that follow us, if they are defined as they are in the review, that therefore they are a threat or otherwise, then that at least informs the government and makes the House, or allows the House, to pressure the government to take real concern about what they might be doing. And who knows in the future, a government, either side of the House or in various different forms, may well choose, under pressure from China over economic issues, to let them accede to the treaty. Who knows? I don't say that that's the mood, but I do say it's for backbenchers, therefore, to make their point about what they should do, and the government to take note. And in that regard, I leave the House with my amendment.
Report, accession of states to the CPTPP.
The question is that new clause 1 be read a second time. Liam Byrne.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the right honourable gentleman. I want to speak in support of the amendment which is tabled in his name, but also the amendments which are tabled in the name of my honourable and right honourable friends. I want to welcome this debate this afternoon. I want to welcome the amendments which have been put down, but I want to lament the fact that we have not been permitted a full debate on the treaty, something that the right honourable gentleman argued very eloquently for, because we needed a debate today, Madam Deputy Speaker, not merely on the 3 chapters of CPTPP which are covered by this bill, but the full 30 chapters of the treaty itself, with all of the associated annexes and bits of analysis and arguments too. Now, I don't want to detain the House very long this afternoon, because our Select Committee had gone to the lengths of actually writing a report and publishing that earlier on this year. But I did just want to underline this point about the lack of scrutiny, because, of course, it was the government itself in the Grimstone Rule that said that there would not be any new FTAs ratified by His Majesty's government without a full debate on whether we should agree to that treaty. Now, when I asked the Secretary of State on the 23rd of January whether she would agree to a debate under the terms of CRAG, she said that she would be happy to support such a debate. Her officials then wrote to clerks on the Select Committee to say that indeed such a debate had been requested, only to be told by, of all, the leader of the House that there was no time available. And indeed, the leader confirmed that in writing to me last week in a letter in which he said it has not been possible to find a time for a debate in government time. Yet, Madam Deputy Speaker, the House of Lords is having a debate on this today, on the recommendation of the International Treaties Committee. So why can't we? Are we second-class representatives in this House? Are we unqualified to have a debate on all 30 chapters of this treaty? Are we not qualified to speak on behalf of the people we came into public life to represent about how this treaty will affect their future? I think we are. I think we should have a debate on the full treaty. And I cannot believe that we are out of time, because some of you will have seen the Financial Times report last week that said a working day, on average, in this chamber, in this Parliament, in their words, has been shorter than any other in the past quarter century. So are we seriously saying that we have not been able to find a time for a debate which the government's policy is to support on, frankly, what is one of the only free trade agreements that His Majesty's government has been able to bring forward since we left the European Union? Now, the Minister, I noticed on Twitter, I'm a keen follower of the Minister on Twitter, he'll be pleased to hear, he said on Twitter, I think last week, that there have been 4 parliamentary debates on the treaty, but I wonder if he's sure about that, because when I asked the clerks on the Select Committee to check that, they were frankly scratching their heads a little bit. They couldn't find all 4 of the treaties that the Minister referred to. And we have to accept that there is no shortage of controversy in this bill, not least because the Secretary of State herself has resiled from the figures that describe the benefits of this treaty to the country. Give way to...
I'm the chair of the committee, and it's a pleasure serving on the committee with him, and I thought I might just throw a bone in the form of cross-party support about this point, which is that it's not just pointing out the controversies, it's also about having the justification and opportunity to debate these issues on which our constituents care, because these trade deals do make a difference not only to the businesses but to the services and to the agriculture sectors that we have within our respective constituencies. And that is why it is also damaging, because it fails to allow us the opportunity to be able to persuade people that trade deals can be a force for good.
Well, Donald Gentleman is absolutely right, and I commend his contribution both to the committee and to the report that we published about CPTPP earlier in this year. Now, in the group of amendments that we have before us, we have a number of important amendments, not only about the future expansion plans of CPTPP and what our policy on those expansion plans might look like, but also we have important amendments in the names of my honourable friends about ISDS. Now, the reason that these are so important is that in all of the fanfare, in all of the arguments, in all of the passionate bits of literature and speeches offered by the government about the virtues of this treaty, it was always positioned in this way. It was always positioned as a gateway to the fastest growing economy on earth and a place that is going to represent a significant fraction of economic growth in the future. But of course, what was often missing from those eloquent descriptions was a recognition that actually the countries in CPTPP are only about a fifth, at best, of the Indo-Pacific region. And so we are surely right to worry that there could well be a government drive to expand the bite of this treaty, the orbit of this treaty, to a much wider group of nations. And of course, if the government really wants to take aim at the biggest economies on earth, then it may well be encouraging China to join. But when I asked the Secretary of State whether it was her policy to either agree or to block China's accession, she said that is not something which we can discuss on the floor of the House, or indeed in committee. So that is why safeguards are needed. We might even, Madam Deputy Speaker, be so bold as to merely ask for a little bit of clarity about what the government's strategy for the future might be. And that is why these amendments about the future pathway of this treaty are so important, and why I hope we'll have a vote on some aspect of it today, even if it is not the Right Honourable Gentleman's amendment. The second amendment that I just wanted to talk about very briefly was the amendment that bites on ISDS. This is an important amendment because, of course, His Majesty's Government has agreed side letters with a number of countries to take us out of the ISDS process. That is not an exemption, that is not a safeguard that we sought when it came to agreeing to this treaty, and yet we know, because the treaty includes countries like Canada. I think we're just about on fraternal relations with Canada at the moment. We may have failed to get an FTA agreed with them, quite why as a matter of some dispute between the Canadian government and the Secretary of State. But of course, Canada is home to some of the biggest pension fund investors on the planet, and that we know those are funds which are especially litigious. And although the Minister was right when he answered these questions in earlier conversations to say that we've never lost an ISDS case, the reality is that many fear there will be a chilling effect on the regulations that we bring forward because of a fear of the peril of ISDS procedures in the future. I give way.
Very much, and he's speaking very well on some of the amendments that I have put down, particularly on ISDS. It is, of course, true that if it was good enough for New Zealand to get the side letters for all member states, so they were protected more, not fully protected, I grant him, if it's good enough for New Zealand, it should have been good enough for us. And is it not a sign that ministers actually have lacked ambition on this rather than actually a sign of complacency?
Well, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. And perhaps it's because we didn't want to overly annoy the Canadians. But I mean, the truth is that talks with the Canadians have broken down. At a cost, by the way, to the UK automotive industry. In fact, UK cars will be hit by, on average, a £3,000 tariff in about a month or two because of the breakdown of those talks. But why we don't have these procedures, why we don't have these safeguards, why we don't have these side letters is something that I think it is important for us to bring to a vote in the amendments which have been tabled. The final point, I suppose, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I wanted to conclude with is to underline the point that was made by the Right Honourable Gentleman for Chingford and Woodford Green. As a House, we have got to become far more skilled, far more ready, far more adroit in debating the kinds of treaties that we will be asked to sign in the future. Once upon a time, when the Berlin Wall came down, we promised we could look forward to a new world of free trade, and we hoped that that free trade could bring political progress and democratic process. Wandel durch Handel, I think, as the Germans like to say. But the truth is that reality is now smashed. That era ended with the second invasion of Ukraine. We are now in new times when we do not have to simply debate military security, but we now have to debate economic security too. And economic security questions are always freighted with dilemmas. We're a small nation, but our adversaries are big. We must act always with our allies, but not all of our allies are good, and many of our friends would prefer not to pick a side. Our adversaries, they plan for self-sufficiency, but we cannot. We prefer open and free trade, but global supply chains are risky. We like markets to decide, but security always requires state action. We know that we need to work proactively to shape the long term, but democracies entail so often a short-term change of government, and too often our politics is reactive. These dilemmas, there are no right answers to these dilemmas. We together are going to have to find ways of navigating. Do we act alone or together? Should we be open or closed? Can we act in the short term, or do we need to think for the long term? Do we use carrots or sticks? Is it a broad canvas of action, or do we need a targeted approach? These are things that are hard to answer, but unless we have the debates on this in the House, we will not grow the skills and the experience to make good and wise decisions for the future. That's why we needed a debate under the CRAG process on the CPTPP treaty. This debate today is important, but it is second best.
Sir Liam Fox.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's always a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Birmingham and Hodge Hill, and I rise to echo the comments made by my Right Honourable friend for Chingford and Woodford Green, comments which he made extremely eloquently and clearly, to which I would like to add just a few comments of my own. I've always been in favour of CPTPP, and as I said when I was at the front bench in 2019, it's absolutely essential, particularly given the rise of protectionism globally, that we commit ourselves to a rules-based system based on the WTO. Of course, we have the abilities to augment that by other regional relationships, which is why we've had the public consultation and debate in Parliament about potential accession to CPTPP. I have always believed that the benefits of CPTPP have always been at least as much about geopolitics than they have been about simple import and export numbers. As the Royal United Services Institute put it, joining CPTPP provides the UK with not just economic benefits, but the means to help define and defend a rules-based order in the face of China's diplomatic and economic heft. So, at a time of tense relations, as they are between China and the United States, the United Kingdom has joined a trade agreement in which neither are present at the present time, although the United States was instrumental in its creation, a point I shall return to later. The March 2023 Integrated Review Refresh describes the Indo-Pacific as, and I quote, critical to the UK's economy, security, and our interest in an open and stable international order. Developments there will have disproportionate influence on the global economy, on supply chains, as the Right Honourable Gentleman immediately before me mentioned, strategic stability, and the norms of state behaviour. So CPTPP, in turn, is about the contribution to the stability of the global trade and investment system. So, within that debate, what do we perceive China's security threat to the United Kingdom to be? Well, in its reply to the Intelligence and Security Committee, in the section entitled The Strategic Context, the government stated that China almost certainly maintains the largest state intelligence apparatus in the world. The nature and scale of the Chinese intelligence services are, like many aspects of the Chinese government, hard to grasp for the outsider due to the size of the bureaucracy, the blurring of the lines of accountability between the party and state officials, a partially decentralised system, and a lack of verifiable information. Now, the government has also set out that the Chinese intelligence services target the UK and its overseas interests prolifically and aggressively. While they seek to obtain classified information, they're willing to utilise intelligence officers and agents to collect open-source information indiscriminately, given the vast resources at their disposal. And then, to compound the problem, it's not just the Chinese intelligence services. The Chinese Communist Party co-opts every state institution, company and citizen. And this whole-of-state approach means that China can aggressively target the UK and UK interests, wherever those interests are globally, which, sadly, we have discovered to our cost in many of our governmental institutions here. So, the question, given all of that, is that could China actually be admitted to CPTPP? And if it's theoretically possible, how likely is it? Well, I think it's instructive first to look at the WTO experience, which my right honourable friend on the front bench and I shared over several years of my extremely enjoyable working with him at DIT. When China acceded to the WTO in 2001, the West saw it as promising and promoting economic and political reform. It was a time of great optimism that the Chinese communist system could be pulled in a direction that was advantageous to and in the interests of the West. However, Jiang Zemin, the Chinese leader at the time, claimed that the motive of the United States in all of this was to, quote, westernize and divide socialist countries. Thus, the WTO itself was heading for a stalemate in its direction of travel, almost from the point at which China acceded to it. Now, this has added to the other WTO problems. And I mention this because we need to look at CPT within that wider trading framework. The WTO's problems have been compounded by its adoption of the concept of unanimity, whereas its rules talk about consensus. Now, if consensus and unanimity meant the same thing, there wouldn't be two different words for it in the founding documents. But it has meant that virtually any country within the WTO now exercises a right of veto And this has prevented us from moving forward in what we perceived it to be a process of genuine liberalisation of global trade. Now, there's not been a single... I will.
I apologise for interrupting his excellent speech. But, of course, the key was we were told at the time, and this persuaded the government, that this would change China. And, in fact, what we've found is that China is now changing the terms of the debate because they haven't changed at all. If anything, got worse. So isn't that a very good reason why we need to debate these issues whenever we can?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. And as I mentioned at the time, President Clinton took the view that this was the best hope that the West had of pulling China into a much more market-orientated, rules-based economy, where we could get the benefits of a more liberal global economy. That is not how it turned out. In fact, we've only had one multilateral treaty since the WTO was created, and that was the 2017 Trade Facilitation Agreement. So there's a hierarchy of the agreements that we can get in terms of liberalisation. A multilateral agreement is the best, but given, as I've said, the effective veto that countries have, that's unlikely, and it's very unlikely to give us the benefits that we'd like to see, especially in trade liberalisation in services. The next best is a plurilateral agreement, the next best is regional, and then you're down to what some people would unkindly describe as the bargain basement of bilateral FTAs. But all of them are useful in creating a more liberal global trading environment. But if China were to seek to join CPTPP, it would need to commit to liberalisation in line with CPTPP requirements, and this would require there to be a reduced role for the Chinese state. Now, if anyone who watches current affairs thinks that the Chinese state is tending in the direction of a smaller influence, then they're watching different news outlets from Iain. China could, of course, seek a bespoke agreement in terms of joining CPTPP, but the UK has already set the precedent by joining on current terms. And even if they could join CPTPP, China, could it be trusted to meet any of the conditions of accession? Although Chinese leaders have declared their willingness to meet the conditions, many countries are extremely sceptical given China's behaviour as a WTO member. China has a poor record when it comes to complying with WTO rules and observing the fundamental principles on which the WTO agreements are based, principles of non-discrimination, openness, reciprocity, fairness and transparency. And China's subsidies, overcapacity, intellectual property theft and protectionist non-market policies exacerbate distortions in the global economy. And even more worrying than all of these, China's use of trade as a tool of coercive diplomacy has raised concerns further, especially given their behaviour towards Australia and to Japan. This is not the sort of partner we should be wishing to see join us in CPTPP, unless there are previously unimagined changes in behaviour. And finally, Mr. Speaker, a word, if I may, beyond this chamber to our US colleagues. I believe that the decision to leave TPP by the United States was a mistake. It removed from United States policymakers a tool in terms of its strategic ability to shape events in the region. UK accession provides an opportunity for the United States to seek to join this new grouping and gain greater direct influence over China trade relations with the fastest growing economic zone in the world. All of these are reasons why we must have a very close eye on what happens with China and our new membership of CPTPP. We have gained a great deal. We can't afford to have it thrown away by ourselves or by others.
We now come to a maiden speech. Damien Egan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is with great pleasure that I rise to give my maiden speech this afternoon. And speaking to this bill, which aims to boost international trade and economic growth, stimulating growth and trade, is vital to my constituents in Kingswood as it creates new jobs and is ultimately about how we fund our public services. As is tradition in a maiden speech, I'd like to pay tribute to my predecessor, Chris Skidmore. I learned in the election that there's a reason why Chris's vote would go up every time he stood. Throughout the by-election, people talked very warmly about Chris. He was described as being a good man, someone driven by values. I know some might say a double-edged sword. But perhaps most importantly that he cared. And I heard some really complicated pieces of casework where Chris had personally given a lot of his time to get people the help that they needed. So I'd like to place on record my thanks to Chris for his 14 years of service to the people of Kingswood. Yeah. Now, Kingswood had 4 MPs before Chris. Roger Berry, who was a tireless campaigner, in fact still is, for disability rights. He brought forward the Civil Rights for Disabled Persons Bill in 1993, and that galvanised support for future legislation that made discrimination against disabled people illegal. And Kingswood's 3 other MPs were Rob Hayward, Jack Aspinwall and Terry Walker. And on my second day here, when I got into my office, the first letter I received was from Terry Walker. So if you're listening, Terry, thank you. Now, I've been asked by some members, so where exactly is Kingswood? Kingswood lies on the eastern side of Bristol. I'd say that more people than not would say that they live in Bristol. It is a suburban collection of towns and villages that stretches from the edge of the city and then extends into what is beautiful countryside. Kingswood has an interesting story. In medieval times, it served as a royal hunting ground, quite literally, the King's Wood. In the 18th century, it was a thriving home for workers from nearby coal mines. And it was at this time that John Wesley was encouraged to deliver his very first outdoor sermons that he delivered in Kingswood. Now, I must be one of thousands of children over the years who was taken at primary school to the site of these sermons, Hannah Mount, where today a spiring green beacon illuminates the spot where Wesley once preached. In the early 20th century, Kingswood hosted the largest motorbike factory in the world, the Douglas Motorbike Factory, where 25,000 motorbikes were made to support the military in World War I. And in one of those quirky bits of history, and it is one that did catch me out in a radio interview, legend has it that Kingswood hosted an elephant burial when Nancy, who was part of a travelling menagerie, died of ewe-leaf poisoning. I'm told archaeologists are investigating. Now, being elected in a by-election towards the end of a parliament, it does focus the mind. You have to think about making your moments count. Indeed, Rishi could still call a surprise election tomorrow. So I thought that as well as giving you a little bit about Kingswood itself, I also wanted to share with you, Mr. Speaker, what the people of Kingswood told me during the campaign, and I hope that there's issues there that are pertinent to members, whatever party you're representing in this chamber. I think the first thing to say is that people told me that family life had become much harder. I spoke to parents who told me that they're stressed, they're exhausted, they're doing all the right things, they're working hard, putting in the extra hours, paying the bills, but people told me time and again that they feel like they're just existing through life and not living it. And it isn't like people are asking for a lot, but when you do work hard, you ought to be able to feel secure for your future. You should also be left with enough money to enjoy life, to pay for meals out, order that occasional takeaway, plan nice trips for the children, or book a family holiday. I'm sure no one here would think that that's a lot to ask for. But I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that for an increasing number of working people in Kingswood, these are now out of reach luxuries. People told me how that they feel that they're paying more, but that they're getting less. We don't have a single NHS dentist accepting new patients, not just in Kingswood, but anywhere in the entire Bristol area. And with doctors, it's so hard to get in. I spoke to one woman, she had to call her doctors 117 times before she got through, only to be told, we're full up today, call back tomorrow. I want to say that there is a lot of sympathy for the challenges that the government have faced, not just with all the different prime ministers, but particularly with COVID and with Ukraine and the pressure that that has put on public finances. But people do want to see us doing better with the money that we do have. People told me that they don't feel safe, that they don't see enough police. Interestingly, I spoke to one police officer, long-term police officer, and he spoke because he's frustrated because of increased bureaucracy. He's sat behind his desk when he said, in his words, he joined the police to catch criminals. Bus cuts, we've got whole areas in Bristol now that don't have any buses. It's great news for our taxi drivers who work very hard driving people all around the city, but of course not everyone can afford a taxi. The decline of the high street came up a lot. Kingswood has changed so much from when I was growing up, and it's sad to see. There is hope, though, with some investment planned by the council that I hope really does kickstart the improvements that many of us want to see. And then also on that list, apprenticeships and opportunities for well-paid work were high up there. Kingswood used to be a hub for apprenticeships. My dad was an apprentice, one of 140 in his year, all from local schools. But the grandchildren of his generation don't have those same volume of opportunities to go straight from school and into the workplace. And we all miss out on their skills. Education generally, South Gloucestershire schools are the lowest funded in the country. Why? Now, these are some of the concerns. It's obviously not an exhaustive list, and I could have dedicated a whole speech to potholes. There were some national concerns too, immigration being one, and real worries about how, in a rapidly changing world, with growing threats to peace, how we're doing all we can to invest in and support our armed forces. Yeah. I spoke to soldiers who were looking for second jobs, and I spoke to the wife of one who told me that some of her husband's equipment is held together with gaffer tape. A winter by-election is weeks and weeks of knocking on cold, wet doors. I know many colleagues joined. For me, it was a privilege to have so many real, honest, normal conversations, so far removed from the angry online echo chambers, a reminder that the social media bubble that has become so dominant does not reflect mainstream Britain and the everyday challenges that people face. I hope to give you a little flavour of Kingswood, not just the place, but the people too. And I'll leave you with this. There is a reason why Kingswood usually picks the winner at every general election. Kingswood is a representative voice of decent British people who work hard and play by the rules, who love their families and just want the best for their children. Our job is to make sure that the country that they give so much to gives them a good future in return. Thank you.
As Remain in the South West, Anthony Mangnall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege to be able to follow the honourable member for Kingswood, and can I congratulate him on his maiden speech. It is somewhat frustrating to be one of the younger members on this side and find new members turning up looking fresher and healthier and readier for the fight. He has also managed to unify the House when talking about potholes. I don't think he'll find any disagreement, but he comes to this place with a huge amount of experience, not just in fighting other seats, but also as the Mayor of Lewisham, where he did some extraordinary work on community land trusts, which some of us across the House have commented on and would like to follow in our own respective constituencies. And I'm sure his family who are here somewhere will be proud of his maiden speech today. He's done himself very well. Mr. Speaker, if I may, I'd like to make a few remarks on the debate around CPTPP, the tongue twister that seems to have made many members in this place fall sideways. But I think we should start by actually recognising what the United Kingdom has managed to do over the last 4 years. We have recognised the ambition, the global ambition of fulfilling our trade objectives. We have now succeeded in joining CPTPP, but it's not just that trade deal alone. It is Japan, Australia, New Zealand, the Singapore Digital Partnership, Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. I spend my life repeating these deals because I think it is important that we recognise the true value that these deals are having, not just to GDP, but to businesses, to the economies, to the environment, to business people all across the United Kingdom and indeed the world. It shows we are determined to fulfil our promise and our commitment to sign deals to bolster our position in the world. And of course, course, it's also underway, negotiations are underway with the Gulf Cooperation Council, Israel, and others. And in joining CPTPP, we are joining the fastest region in the world. Now, with tariff-free trade relations, the UK is set to increase trade by 37 billion by 2030 to the countries currently in CPTPP, a market worth 110 billion to UK trade, and with growth between 2016 and 2019 at 8%, UK membership is only expected to boost that figure. And the conservative figures, and I say conservative figures because I feel they underestimate it, suggest that it will be a £1.8 billion increase to GDP and an £800 million boost to take-home pay for workers. And added to which, the estimates show that trade with the 11 members increases on average by 65%, with the West Midlands, Scotland and Northern Ireland benefiting most. So I look forward to hearing the SNP's point of view and whether or not they will be supporting it. Of course, as has already been made, the point in this deal is that it allows us to have tariff-free trade with goods, it has new product regulations, it expands our role and opportunity with services, and it ensures mobility for business people. Digital trade is enhanced, intellectual property enshrined with benchmarks created by the United Kingdom, and of course enshrines sustainability at its core. But I would like to, in the course of my remarks, focus on a couple of amendments, namely New Clause 1 and New Clause 4. It has been my cause, or war, or campaign, however you want to phrase it, over the last 4 years, to argue that Parliament should do better around our trade agreements. We should spend more time scrutinising them. We should spend more time debating them. It is always a source of frustration that when we do have debates on trade, so few people actually show up. Because the failure in this House to be able to explain the value of a trade deal to our constituents, to be able to justify it in terms of economic value, to be able to talk about it in terms of potential security risk, is diminished when we don't have opportunities on the floor of this House to be able to discuss the merits or demerits of any trade agreement. However, where I disagree on New Clause 1 and New Clause 5 is not because I'm being belligerent or that the whips have got me under the cosh. It is much more because I think what we need to focus on is reforming the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act. It cannot be the case that Parliament is able to opine on every single international treaty. And in the course of his remarks, the Right Honourable Gentleman for Chingford and Woodford Valley made the point about whether or not accession to CPTPP should be debated on the floor of this House. Well, there could be no limit to that, but he didn't explain, and I will take an intervention from him if he wants to, about how he would get around the royal prerogative issue of free trade agreements not being, international trade agreements not being in the hands of Parliament rather than in government and in government ministers. That hasn't been considered in his remarks.
Well, I agree, and I couldn't possibly have taken this even further, but the point I'm making is that I know that the Foreign Office dislikes any idea of debate and discussion, but we have a Trade Department, and the Trade Department needs to be imbued with the powers to be able to make sure that happens. So I am completely in favour of just punching through the nonsense and ill use of the prerogative in this particular regard.
Well, I understand that, but I feel punching through on this occasion would be the wrong approach. And I agree with him about the Foreign Office's appetite for us to debate these issues in this place shouldn't matter one jot. It is our right as parliamentarians to be able to discuss free trade agreements and whether or not they work. So therefore, I come back respectfully and say that the measure and the mechanism to be able to ensure that we get better trade agreements, that we can be reassured by them in terms of economic value, in terms of the benefits to the British people, and indeed to our own national security, has to be by upgrading the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act. And the Honourable Gentleman for Brighton made an excellent point in remarking to his own report from the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee about their recommendations in how we could actually enshrine a methodology within this place to ensure that CRAG operates within the 21 sitting days and that a meaningful vote is had at the end of it. And it is a meaningful vote. If it were ever to take place, it would be meaningful because it would delay by 21 days any free trade agreement from being signed. Delighted to.
He's making a very good point, of course, on the need for change of CRAG, what we said in our report. I mean, our report made it clear that a lot of changes don't necessarily need legislative change, but they do need a change of approach from the government, commitments made at the dispatch box, a clear commitment that debates will always be called when there is significant interest, and commitments particularly around new accession. If those commitments were given, we believe that that would be enough, but those commitments still are not quite forthcoming enough. And does he agree with me that the government should stand at the dispatch box today and give those commitments so we can move forward with some certainty?
The honourable gentleman and I have served for a long time on the International Trade Committee as it was on its own, and I should actually start off by responding to him by paying enormous credit to the Secretary of State, who did come in front of the committee on a number of times and did commit and did write to the Leader of the House for time in this House to debate CPTPP within the Cragg period. Now, I'm afraid my ire and irritation must now be focused at the Leader of the House as to why we haven't secured that time. But it is important, and he's right to say there are simple steps that we can take to make sure that this House is properly briefed about how we discuss these issues. And actually one of them would be, and I absolutely declare my interest, is give Privy Councillor status to the members of the Business and Trade Committee. I don't think anyone would disagree with it. It's certainly a very popular move, and when it's been mentioned in committee, it's been welcomed with open arms. And I'm glad it's got the approval of the House. But in all seriousness, there has to be a set process, and the Cragg mechanism allows us that opportunity if done properly. It is there. It must be reformed, regardless of who is in government. It is in the interest of the entire House to amend and implement Cragg and ensure that there is... Yes, of course I will.
I fully agree with all his wider purpose in what he's saying. But I come back to the fact right now, and Lord Lisvane made that very clearly, in regard to the entry of a security risk country, we still do not have the ability to debate that. And he pointed out Cragg doesn't do that because of the nature of it. So all I'm saying is, I agree with what he says on a wider front, Cragg got to be reformed, but we have a bill going through the House at the moment. It's a better time to at least get a foothold in that debate rather than say we'll do it another time.
I accept the point. I really do accept the point the honourable gentleman is making, because how can I disagree when he's making the argument on national security? I think it's absolutely essential. But what he's asking for is actually may be viewed in very different terms within the 11 other members of CPTPP. There are standards to join CPTPP in the first place that would prevent China from joining unless they improved their act. Now, he talked about the lessening or the lessening of appetites in places like Australia for China to join. I'm not sure whether or not that is the case, but there is a standard within CPTPP which would stop China from joining. And of course, was already remarked by the Honourable Member for the New Forest, we have a veto in this instance. So actually, I think it's more about this place ensuring that we have the debate in this place, debate the values of a trade agreement, have the vote. And if we are worried about new accession to CPTPP, then it is for us to make the case to the Secretaries of State, both in the Foreign Office and in the Department of Trade. I'll just make this point, and for them to go back to the other 11 countries of CPTPP and to make the case in that way. Yes, of course I will.
I welcome almost everything the honourable gentleman is saying, my honourable friend. We've worked together a lot on this issue, but the reality is other countries in the CPTPP have arrangements that allow their parliaments to have deliberation on significant changes to the treaty and the incoming of new members in the treaty. And we are talking not about the CPTPP arrangements, but we are talking about our arrangements on authorising our government to go ahead and agree. And it would not, surely he must agree, undermine CPTPP if we were to make our own arrangements on how we were then to instruct our government.
Forgive me if it sounds trite to say to the honourable gentleman that I worry about mission creep, because if you do it on this, do you not do it also on the World Health Organization? Do you not do it on any other body that may be under the guise of some suspicion of some adverse state actor being involved in it? So I worry about the way in which you go about this, and I worry about Parliament always trying to have a say and slowing down the process of the way in which our trade agreements are signed and ratified. We do need to be efficient, we do need to be quick in the way in which we do it, but we also need to make sure that we have the opportunity, like we do today, to be able to debate the merits of the 3 chapters within this bill. I do want to sort of end on a parting shot, which is that as has already been mentioned by the chair of the Business and Trade Committee, we were offered, or we were told, that we would have the opportunity to debate this within Cragg, and I mean the full 30 chapters of CPTPP. It is disappointing that we do not have that. The government, and again, I say the Secretary of State and Minister have done an amazing job in engaging with the committee. They really have. But this is a serious disappointment, and it does lessen the progress that has been made to date on signing new trade agreements and ensuring that this place has a say say in our future.
Sarah Green.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I stand to move new clause 12 tabled in my name, and will also speak to new clause 11 and 13. I'd like to begin by once again stating that the Liberal Democrats want to see an ambitious trade policy aimed at creating opportunities for British firms around the world and new jobs here in our country. This bill and our accession to CPTPP are a step in that direction. The point has been well made in this House and in the other place that the projections put forward in the Government's own impact assessment are of GDP growth of just 0.06% by 2040. So while the UK's accession to the trading bloc can and should be welcomed, the cause for celebration is limited. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd like to speak to 3 amendments which aim to address some key issues with the bill and with the UK's accession. New clause 12, tabled in my name, would require the Government to publish an assessment of the impact of the CPTPP's performers' rights provisions. We know the worries of our creative industries surrounding this bill. The lack of reciprocal arrangements for UK artists in CPTPP countries leaves our creatives exposed. The UK is rightly proud of our world-leading creative industries, and we should also be proud of a world-leading intellectual property regime. We must be sure that this bill and this trade deal do nothing to jeopardise that. There is a need for clarity and certainty in this area, and that is why I've tabled new clause 12, which I hope members will support. New clause 13 would require the Government to conduct a review examining how the implementation of the treaty affects the costs faced by exporting and importing businesses in the UK. That report would have to take consideration of the existing costs that those businesses are already facing as a result of trade regulations. We know that the stated ambition of the Government is that the deal will minimise red tape and trade regulations when trading with other CPTPP countries, which is a welcome goal. The British Chamber of Commerce have, however, found that almost 2/5 of businesses list regulations and red tape as a significant barrier to exporting. We need to be assured that our businesses are given the support to trade and flourish. With that in mind, it will be worthwhile after our accession to take the time to assess how the deal and the wider trade regulation landscape is affecting British businesses. That is the purpose of new clause 13. Mr Deputy Speaker, it is clear that CPTPP will likely grow over time. As new countries join and accede to the deal, that will bring new opportunities, but may also pose risks. The potential accession of China is one example, and the concerns regarding that possibility have been well discussed by colleagues in this chamber and in the other place. New clause 11 would require the Government to provide an impact assessment on the accession of countries that have made and will make a formal request to join CPTPP. This will allow us to have a clear and informed vision of what the accession of each new country would mean for the UK. I believe this would be a reasonable and common sense measure. I'd like to finish by echoing what has already been said about parliamentary scrutiny. It is welcome that we're having this debate today, but we are in reality debating a very limited and narrow bill. We do need proper parliamentary scrutiny of trade deals, and I would ask the Government to ensure that this is the case in future.
John McDonnell.
Can I congratulate the honourable friend from Kingswood for his excellent speech? He mentioned he's been elected at the tail end of a government. There'll be election coming soon. Can I reassure him? I think the diligent work is already demonstrated in the House, and his constituency should secure his re-election. And can I also say how wonderful it is to actually hear a speech from a representing the constituency in the accent of the constituency as well. I thought that was excellent. I've got 2 amendments, one amendment to one new clause that I want to address. Although I support virtually every amendment that's been brought forward today, because it does show the weakness in the process by which we've examined this treaty. Can I just mention, before I come on to my own amendments, the issue with regard to the ISDS? I've been involved in discussions with the Secretary of State and the Minister over a number of months on this, and can I just express my concern about the sort of contradiction that there's been about the refusal to secure a side letter in this, with regard to this treaty, in comparison with what happened with regard to Australia and New Zealand, but then also the fact that in the discussions with the free trade agreement with Canada directly, in the negotiating brief, there's a specific part of the remit to prevent an ISDS process. There's a contradiction there somewhere which I've never really got to the bottom of. I want to address Amendment 2 first of all, and it follows on from the debate that we've had fairly lengthily now about the scrutiny of treaties themselves. I haven't given notice to the Honourable Member for Hazel Grove that I was going to refer to him in the Chamber. I'm not sure if you have to give notice when you're about to praise someone rather than criticise them. Can I say, as the Chair, I'm a member of the Public Administration Constitutional Affairs Committee. Can I mention that the Chair of that is the Honourable Member for Hazel Grove, who has become the sort of Walter Bagehot of the 21st century, and with a solid mixture of Trollope in there as well. And he steered through our discussions with regard to how we examine treaties and the formal process, I think with immense skill, and drew in a whole range of evidence which led to a consensus. And it's interesting, there's almost a consensus in this House as well at the moment. And I just quote from the report that we put out. It says, CRAG has been an insufficient legislative tool to facilitate meaningful parliamentary scrutiny of committees. It provides only a passive role for Parliament, and as such there is no opportunity to a Parliament to express its explicit approval or disapproval of a treaty. And I think that's a common theme that's come through all the debates. We've got to do better than this. And the worry is that having read that report, the government really hasn't responded positively to try and get some order to our process itself, particularly around the early negotiating processes and the debates that should take place. The general view we took with regard to this treaty, like the others, is that Parliament has just been largely bypassed. We were offered no say with regard to the government's negotiating objectives at the earliest stage, was important. No oversight of the negotiations as they progressed. And now we're refused a vote on the final terms of accession. This isn't acceptable as a democratic process. The formal CRAG period, just to be clear, under which we can nominally have a say on the agreement, concludes this Friday, after a 21-day period. We're offered no vote or even a debate on the substantive terms of CPTPP during this period. An accession is likely to receive our consent without any of us being given a single vote. As I mentioned to the Right Honourable Gentleman, I have tabled a prayer to try and secure an extension of time to enable the government, therefore, to bring forward time for a debate itself. And when my view is exactly the same as the Honourable Gentleman's, what we're debating at the moment is a very narrow technical implementing bill, and it's no substitute for confirmatory debate and a vote on the accession itself. And I agree with the Chair of the Business and Trade Committee, who raised this with the government in correspondence over the last 2 weeks. And I have to say, it is preposterous for the government then to say with a straight face that there isn't parliamentary time to have this, given the sitting arrangements that we currently have. And for those who've been here maybe as long as me and maybe even longer, there hasn't been a problem on parliamentary time in the past. We've simply found the time and sat and gone through it when the business is so important. So what my Amendment 2 does, it tries to address this wrong and to formalise a requirement for the government to ask for Parliament's consent for the UK's accession to the CPTPP. And I think that's a basic democratic point of principle. If the government doesn't accept this, can I come back then to the urgings of members across the House, really? I just hope the government now will take seriously the recommendations of the committee report for reforming of the process overall. This is an undemocratic structure. The proposals in the PACAC report are, I think, incredibly practical, a sifting process, a sifting committee, identification of those treaties that require longer consideration, but then also giving the House itself a proper process of democratic scrutiny and democratic decision. I just turn briefly to new clause 8 in my name. This deals with the Labour chapter of CPTPPs, and I've raised it before. The point's been made by a number of parliamentary colleagues, and particularly from the TUC and others as well, various campaigning organisations, throughout this sort of ratification process, that the Labour provisions of the CPTPP are outdated and inadequate. This treaty will include a number of countries, some of which have been mentioned, and the prospect of others joining as well, where abuses of labour rights are widespread, and they basically making effective labour provisions, therefore, is vitally important in any treaty we undertake. And I think that's been an expression of view across the House over a number of years now. If I just give the examples, in Brunei and Vietnam, independent trade unions are banned. They're not allowed to legally operate. In Malaysia, mention's been made previously in our debates, forced labour has been documented extensively, and we've been raised in this House time and time again. So in this context, it's crucial that the CPTPP's labour provisions are readily enforceable, and they're linked to the removal of trade preferences to ensure that membership does not lead, exactly as the Honourable Gentleman said, to a race to the bottom when it comes to labour standards. And I agree with him. My fear of China is this, is that I have trade union colleagues from Hong Kong who I've worked with over decades who are in prison at the moment purely and simply because they're trade unionists and because they've stood up for democratic rights. The labour protections in certainly.
Right, Honourable Gentleman. The point that I was trying to make was that there's also an economic issue. Because if China, which it does on a wide scale, practices slave or forced labour, it undercuts all the rational and reasonable labour. And one good example is here in the UK, we are desperately trying to get more and more of these solar arrays in. The solar arrays, the polysilicates that are actually critical to that, are mined in Xinjiang under slave labour. No wonder they undercut everybody else, but we still pay for it.
It's a point of economic principle that this will occur once you ensure that you do not have proper rights installed and also the proper regulation and then the appropriate sanctions when it takes place. At the moment, that isn't contained in this treaty, and the reason for this is that, of course, a member state can challenge another member state for failing to uphold labour rights, but it's been demonstrated time and time again across these various treaties that such a failure that affected trade is notoriously difficult. So to challenge those labour practices, you have to demonstrate the effect on trade. But under current provisions, it's almost impossible. The International Trade TUC, the ITUC, has pointed to the ability of states to buy their way out of issues via dispute settlement. That's true. But the compensation amount has been calculated time and time again as a fraction of the violation of the impact on trade itself. So the sanctions do not work, and they will not work under this treaty itself. The ineffectual nature of the labour rights chapter, I think, is demonstrated by the fact that since the agreement's conclusion in 2018, no government has challenged another for abusing labour rights. It's not working. So again, if the government is not willing to accept this amendment, I just hope that this is an issue that a future government consideration will be given, and that we then have the ability to raise with the CPTPP partner countries through the formal review process so that labour protections can eventually be significantly strengthened. That may well come under a new government after the election, but can I just reassure the whole House that this is an issue that a number of us will not drop. It will come back time and time again, both in terms of getting proper democratic scrutiny, but then also on issues like labour rights, that we ensure that we're protecting both our own economy from exploitation, but also those workers themselves in those individual countries from the exploitation that has been evidenced so succinctly in this House in various debates.
Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And it is a pleasure to follow the maiden speech of my honourable friend, the member for Kingswood. And what I would say is what a great way of upstaging your sister who had her wedding the weekend afterwards is force a by-election and then win it. But I suspect it was a happy moment for all the family concerned, and it is a delight to have you here. I put forward 2 amendments on this particular bill. I've sat on the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, and in its previous iteration, the International Trade Committee, which we scrutinised this particular bill, I felt like sometimes to death. But the problem is with scrutiny, without any actual teeth, it means that our words are lost in the ether of words that this House produces all the time. Unless there is debate in the main chamber, the reality is that the body of weight is not put behind those words and those concerns. And it is clear to me that we need to change our constitutional make-up of how we do trade deals. I, of course, support everything that the PACAT committee said, but I personally would go further. I personally think that we probably do need legislative changes on CRAG, despite the fact that we could do some of it through trust, and a good start would be through trust, because the reality is, since we left the European Union, I know we're not meant to go on about leaving the European Union, but since we left the European Union, we have now less scrutiny over trade deals in this House than we did before. Because in this House, it used to be that a consent was required that would go via the European Scrutiny Committee. In this House, it was required that consent to be sent to the European Union before they could sign a trade deal off. And we know in other places around the world that legislators around Europe, legislators did hold back trade deals that were inappropriate. The EU-Canada deal, for example, was held back by the Wallonian Parliament because it failed to address things like workers' rights that my honourable friend has mentioned, and they renegotiated, and they got a better deal for all Europeans. And we could have done that at any step of the way when we were in Europe, and now we're out of the European Union. We are less able to do that. We are less able to hold our negotiating person. Negotiating person at that point was the European Commission. Our negotiating people now are government ministers and our civil servants, but we are less able to actually hold them to account. We can't set their negotiating mandate that we were able to do. We can't actually stop a trade deal that we were able to do. Yes, we can delay it. Yes, the minister is a fantastic minister in coming to be held to account in questioning, but the hard stop, which means that people listen to you rather than just have a nice discussion and debating club with you, has now been lost. And so I do think that we need to reflect that changing world. I will give way.
I'm incredibly grateful to the Honourable for giving way, and we've discussed this across 2 sets of committees that we've both been on at great length, and I'm hugely sympathetic to every point he's making. But there is one counter-argument to that, which is one that hasn't been put forward. And that is that the negotiating position of our negotiators who are going out and striking these deals in the first place would potentially be slightly weakened by the fact that they would then have to check back to a legislature that would then ratify it or not. And that if we to take away that final decision from our negotiators, they wouldn't be able to negotiate such a strong deal. And I put that forward as a counter-argument, not necessarily as the definitive answer.
He's quite right that some people claim that it would do that. Others claim it actually strengthens it. When the EU says this is our backstop, you know they're not bluffing because the backstop has been set by the Parliament, So it actually also can say now, negotiators can say, well, we know that's not really the backstop because you can go away and cajole your backbenchers to just vote this through anyway. Whereas in other systems, they can say, well, I'm really sorry, you know that the Senate is not going to approve this because the committee is holding my feet to the fire here. But there are also other ways of doing it. You can, as other members have mentioned, allow Privy Council status, meet in camera, where actually you're involved in the negotiations. You can, in multilateral processes, we know that other governments embed parliamentarians in their negotiating team. The Norwegians, for example, embed parliamentarians in their WTO negotiating teams. in the day-to-day, backwards and forwards, so that it because of course the WTO is done by a different department than bilateral teams in Norway, so it is there's a slightly different way they negotiate on the different kinds of deals, and so you can determine what kind of deal it is in terms of what kind of level of negotiation and involving Parliament it is. So if Norway was dealing with the CPTPP, it would be parliamentarians embedded, but if they were dealing with the Japan deal, there wouldn't be. Now, so there are granulations of parliamentary overview and scrutiny, but almost all systems have developed that over the last 50 years as trade deals have become basically international lawmaking processes rather than just trade. They deal with all aspects of our life. Whereas we, because we paused our processes effectively when we joined the European Union and have reverted back to our processes, whilst I grant you they are now in the CRAG law, but we have reverted back to where we were before we joined the European Union, and it has not evolved properly. I want to talk about the new clause 2 particularly that I have laid down. Around 90% of the world's palm oil trees are grown in just a few islands in Malaysia and Indonesia, and currently less than 20% of that palm oil is RSPO certificated, that is sustainably forest. The CPTPP will remove tariffs from palm oil. The aim, of course, of removing tariffs is to increase trade. It seems to me unplausible to say that we do not think that unsustainably forest palm oil will therefore not increase in the UK with this trade deal. The same can be true of tropical woods. 2 of the 11 forests that are identified in danger and supply our tropical woods around the world are in the CPTPP region, but there are no additional protections. So my amendment, I will happily give way.
Giving way. Firstly, Indonesia isn't part of CPTPP, but I think it's also important to note that the Malaysians have introduced a certification and standard around a more sustainable palm oil plantation. So I think that, I'm not saying this is the perfection, it certainly isn't. There's a lot further to go, but there is a good example of how actually forming together in a trade agreement through CPTPP, we can actually raise standards, not lower them.
He makes a perfectly sound point. That's why my amendment doesn't say that we shouldn't join CPTPP. It doesn't say that we should block it for those purposes. It requires the Secretary of State to lay down a monitoring report of a level of unsustainable palm oil and forests that are entering this country before we join the CPTPP, to report regularly on that on the imports of unsustainable forestry and palm oil, and if and when this House or the ministers themselves believe that action is needed, the data is there to prove it. If we don't collect the data, we don't know, and then in fact we are blind to the problem. And the same is our obligations on climate change and biodiversity. I personally would prefer a stronger environmental section in this, but it is what it is. But it should also be noted that there are 119 pesticides that are permitted in CPTPP countries that are not permitted here, 56 of which are considered to be highly harmful to human beings. And yes, we have standards for food, but there are no production standards and there are no standards for pesticides that are not food-based. The problem with some of these pesticides, killing of bees, killing of other wildlife that we have, it is not just the human consumptions it harms. Sometimes these pesticides are banned not because they harm human beings, but because they harm the fauna and flora around us. And the import of those goods that contain those pesticides then enter into the food chain, or even worse, enter into the animal food chain, which is not regulated in the same food standards and therefore causes huge problems. And I do think that we need to have also oversight from the government on those points in terms of how they will be ensured that we do not end up with a race to damage some of our crops where we have banned them ourselves. On new clause 3, I particularly am concerned about ISDS. The government at long last, has agreed that we should withdraw from the Energy Charter Treaty, primarily because we see in a changing world where we need to make changes to our energy policy to make it more green, the continual inclusion in the Energy Charter Treaty, which is bound by ISDS agreements, of which we've seen targeted at a number of European states that have made moves to increase environmentally friendly sources of energy, is now a danger to us. Even though we have not lost an ISDS case, it is a danger to our future and a danger to policy making. If we have made that case on energy, I think the case could be made in almost all of our arrangements. It is useful to note that our agreements with Australia, New Zealand and Japan, all of which are part of the CPTPP, did not include ISDS. The agreement with Japan, in fact, included a clause to say that we would not enact ISDS unless we signed or entered another agreement that includes ISDS. So the very fact that this agreement includes ISDS then triggers a number of ISDS courts in other agreements that we have signed. And I do think it is risky and dangerous. We need a report on the risks that it poses to the UK. You can have rogue investors that end up taking us to court, even if it is against the national interest of the respective two states. And of course, citizens can't access ISDS. It's not like a global court in which citizens that have been harmed can go and go and seek redress from the government. It is only corporations that have invested in a particular country. It actually means that corporations that invest from outside into Britain have higher protections than a British corporation that might invest in plants here. I think it is totally wrong that a British corporation is more fragile to changing policy than a foreign corporation. It should be a level playing field, because at the moment a British corporation has no recourse to ISDS if policy changes in Britain and they have invested in Britain, but a corporation does if they are outside. The minister's frowning a bit, so I was just trying to explain the difference. I think that there is also a well-recorded chilling effect of ISDS that we must be particularly acute and aware of. And fundamentally, again, I go back to this thing that we're not meant to mention, the European Union. Under the European Union, at least it was open courts where we appointed judges. ISDS is secret tribunals where we don't even always have British judges. I think there's a problem there. If we were meant to be claiming back control, surely we should be taking away from secret courts and allowing sunlight to be the justice that we seek. But apart from those two amendments, I think this treaty is a step in the right direction. We should support it, but I do wish the government had negotiated as well as New Zealand, had negotiated as well as other countries that sought and won the protections, but we, I'm afraid, our ministers failed to even bother doing.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Like everybody here, let us start with the moment of consensus. It's a privilege to be here for the maiden speech for the member for Kingswood. I didn't actually get to see the beacon that he mentioned in his constituency in my visit. Clearly an oversight on my part, and I hope to rectify it at some point. And also, may I be the first to congratulate his sister on her wedding. Those brothers who usurped their sisters are brave, brave men. And I think only being elected to this place is a justifiable reason to do it. Also, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm going to contradict the member for Brighton, because I think we have to talk about Brexit in this debate, not least because the government has talked about Brexit in promoting the benefits of the CPTPP partnership. And the people of the UK deserve better. They need to understand what is being offered to them and what is being done to reflect their growing recognition of the severe damage that this Tory hard Brexit has done to the British economy and done to British businesses. And so I rise not only to support the amendments put forward by my colleagues on the front bench, but also to support the concerns being raised about democratic oversight and scrutiny of those who might join the CPTPP, but also to speak to new clause 9 that I had tabled, which I'm pleased to say has support from across the House and support from people who disagree on the issue of whether or not Brexit has been a good idea. But I think also recognise that when so much fantasy has dominated the debate, it's about time we had some facts. New Clause 9 was referring to the very real experience of British business right now about the damage that Brexit has done. that already the research suggests £140 billion has drained from our economy. Those trading opportunities, those business opportunities gone. The average Briton being £2,000 worse off. In my constituency in London, £3,500 worse off. That British businesses are crying out for support and help with trade. The University of Sussex research showed that only 6% were positive about Brexit. This was last year. 7 in 10 manufacturers reporting problems with their supply chain. That is why it matters that we look at CPTPP. Now, for avoidance of doubt, I am not here to oppose joining CPTPP, but I'm here to hold the government, and it is government ministers as well as their chums and various right-wing think tanks who promoted the idea that we shouldn't worry about the damage that Brexit under their watch has done to our economy, because programmes like CPTPP are going to replace all those trading opportunities and going to be the hallowed ground that British business can look to. The Trade Secretary herself saying that our accession to CPTPP sends a powerful signal the UK is open for business and using those post-Brexit freedoms to reach out to new markets around the world. She's one of the milder advocates for the idea that not only has Brexit been a roaring success, but also that CPTPP will add to those trading economies. It is no exaggeration to say that CPTPP plus UK is an equivalent economic power to the EU 28. Shankar Sangam of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Goodness me, what a claim to be making. And so I tabled New Clause 9 because I think British business and this place deserves to know the truth about the relative merits of these partnerships and the challenges that our businesses and our communities, and particularly those small and medium-sized enterprises who are struggling with the impact of Brexit, and whether help is indeed coming. And nobody wants to name consistently, is the honest truth, the impact of this partnership deal, not even the Secretary of State herself. Mark Littlewood, also from the Institute of Economic Affairs, has claimed the benefits to Britain will be likely significantly greater than some official estimates driven by static economic models. And the challenge with that argument is that anybody who promotes it, when you ask them, well, what might the actual data be? Where is the evidence that this is going to be that help that British businesses need who are being clobbered by Brexit and all the rules and regulations and tariffs they're now facing? Well, they get the Facebook setting response. It's complicated. That is not good enough for British business. Even the Secretary of State tried that model with the Business Select Committee, claiming that she disputed the idea that the results and the benefits of joining CPTPP to British businesses would be small, but she couldn't actually give an alternative model or an alternative number to give people some crumb of hope they might actually solve those problems with their supply chain. So all we are left with are the claims of greatness, claims which disintegrate on hard contact with the here and now and what is actually being proposed and what actual damage has been done by Brexit. Here and now, those British businesses who find the Brexit border taxes are increasing, although I note today, in a written ministerial question, the government has decided to rewrite some of those Brexit border taxes, which are due to come in at the end of April. So that's great for British business as well. That's stability and planning that they can do when the government even doesn't know how much they're going to charge people. Those tariffs and non-tariff barriers that we now face as a direct result of having left the European Union, that the CPTPP is supposed to reduce, because after all, it's about reducing tariff barriers. Let us look then at the actual data that we have to hand and whether or not we can really judge this partnership as offering that salvation. Now, it's been claimed again, this time by The Telegraph, that this bloc will represent 16% of global GDP. Leapfrogging is the word they use, the combined EU. It's currently actually 10% of global GDP, but, you know, Telegraph and figures, compared to 14% for the European Union. That the CPTPP member countries have a combined population of 500 million and a GDP of 9 trillion. Fantastic, we can be part of trading with them. Nobody would dispute that that would be helpful to British businesses. Just a small reference point, though, that I think this House should take into account, because although the EU is of a similar size, a GDP of 11 trillion, the total value of our trade with the European Union is 557 billion. That's 45% of our total trade. And it's a trade that is falling as a direct result of Brexit, because it used to be 55% of UK exports. And that is because for all the smoke and mirrors, for all the bluster about CPTPP, something very simple. Geography matters. You can fight many things in life, but air miles and transportation costs are not really one of them. So our ability to trade with our nearest neighbours easily and freely matters to British business, far outstretching anything that we could do with those further away. That is why the government's own impact assessment tells us that CPTPP might only make 0.06% of difference to our GDP, or a £2 billion reference. That's also because we'd already got trade deals with most of these countries when we had them as part of the European Union, and we have them already. So only a further 0.33%, 0.33%, not 33%, 0.33% of total UK trade will fall under the new trade agreements. The reality about all of this, and the conundrum that we face, is this is actually only really going to be a big deal if more countries join. That's why, and I'm sorry the member for Somerset is no longer in his place, he was disappointed about America not being part of it. It's only going to actually be the game changer that people want to talk it up to be if more countries join, and then you're looking at the Indo-Pacific region. But the truth is, right here, right now, that is not what we are signing up to. That is not what is being offered to British business. That is why scrutiny matters of who else might join. But it's also why New Clause 9 matters. Because it's not fair to British business to suggest that help is coming when help there is none. And membership of CPTPP is no comparison to EU membership. The sum that it will generate is just a 50th of what the OBR estimate Brexit has already cost the UK economy. Indeed, leaving the single market, they estimate, means that our GDP itself will be 4% lesser over the next 15 years. And some have already estimated that GDP has reduced by 5% because of it. In 2022, the UK exported £340 billion worth of goods and services to the EU. By way of comparison, we exported £64 billion of goods and services to these CPTPP countries. So New Clause 9 is about an honesty with British business about where those markets lie and where they should put their time. It's also about understanding that when we talk about free trade, it's not just about tariffs, it is about regulations, it is about the non-tariff changes that we face. That this could lead to a lowering of food standards and problems with our food supply chain. It could affect our ability, for example, to sign an SPS deal with Europe that might help remove those silly Brexit border taxes that mean that in a couple of weeks' time our constituents are going to be asking us why there's food shortages and food inflation and loads of lorries queued up at Dover trying to get to Sevington. It could lead to challenges for our environment, and the member for Brighton is absolutely right when he raises concerns about palm oil and deforestation. And absolutely, the absolute irony of seeing those people who championed Brexit and now champion the CPTPP not seeming to understand what investor-state dispute settlement provisions are and the lack of democratic accountability, the lack of control that we might have. I don't know who's taking back control under those circumstances because it's behind closed doors. Clearly, there are other deals that we could have been working on as a country that would have made a bigger difference to British business. And that's why this amendment and this clause is so important, because our constituents should demand of us that we are asking those questions and getting those answers from government about the tariffs that are being retained and what impact that will have. For example, for British cheese producers, after all, Canada's dairy industry is being protected. No Wensleydale for Winnipeg. The Trade and Agriculture Commission has warned of the potential increased costs of products due to tariff reductions, because actually UK producers will be held to legally higher sustainable standards. And it's also about the rules of origin and the details around what content is allowed. Now, nobody is disputing that it is helpful to have content accumulation because it helps with those difficulties within supply chains, and ministers have made much about that. But the reality is, had they spent as much time on the Pan-European and Mediterranean Convention, we would have far greater benefits for British business. That binds together more than 60 bilateral trade agreements within the Euro-Mediterranean area. It's not just the European Union, it's much broader than that. 23 contracting parties, each with free trade agreements between them, have a single rules-based origin protocol. That means that British businesses with those struggling supply chains could have got much more help if we'd actually looked at what would really benefit them, if we'd actually just admitted the geography at stake in all of this. So we have shortchanged ourselves, and we're shortchanging the British public if we try to claim that the CPTPP is in any way compensation for the damage that Brexit is doing. The only good thing that we can recognise in challenging those on the right who claim the benefits of CPTPP will far outweigh Brexit is to recognise that their hope and their intention that UK accession will kill off any likelihood we'll ever be part of the EU customs union or single market, from the Telegraph again, that we couldn't have dynamic alignment, is it's just not true. There's plenty of evidence that actually whatever we did, we could rethink. And thank goodness for that, because when things are at stake in terms of British business, it's only right that we ask those questions, that actually there is a process for joining or for being part of changing regulations that we change as part of CPTP that can be reversed if we can do a deal with Europe, if we can actually work out what is in the best interest of British business. And the only way we can do that, Mr Deputy Speaker, is if we actually have the facts to do it. And that's what New Clause 9 is about. And actually, that's why I think that members, whether they agreed with Brexit or opposed it, should support New Clause 9 and that ethos. Because it is about having the data. Because if I am wrong, and in fact actually CTPP is the light at the end of the tunnel for British business, let us stand behind it and prove it and celebrate it. Nobody wants to see British business struggling as a result of Brexit with no help in sight. Every member in this House should get behind the idea that actually we do need good economic modelling, that we should understand the extent of alignment, that we should understand what new trade regulations on carbon pricing might do for British business, that what's happening to trade volumes as a route of these partnerships. But we won't get that data. We'll still get the Facebook answer. It's complicated. We can't really tell you. And all the while, global Britain is really going broke Britain. It's gutted Britain. It's businesses across this country facing reams and reams of paperwork because of Brexit with no end in sight, because this government will not put British business first and renegotiate with Europe for a closer deal. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm sorry that New Clause 9 hasn't been chosen for a vote. I understand why, but I hope that members in this House will join with me in demanding better for British business when it comes not just to trade deals, but to our relationship with Europe. Because for every manager of a small business in this country right now, looking at all the paperwork, all the complications, all the further regulations and excessive costs, and frankly the fact the government can't even tell them what they're going to charge them on the Brexit border tax, well, they are going to come and be in our constituency surgeries asking us for help, and we owe them the respect of having an answer.
Richard Thomson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I say what a pleasure it is to follow the Honourable Lady for Walthamstow, who, in her speech, I think makes an excellent case for rejoining the European Union. I could scarcely put it better myself, and I do hope her leader is listening. But she makes some very, very important points, any teasing aside about the importance of economic data and being able to model the impacts of decisions that government have taken. Now, I rise, Mr Deputy Speaker, to speak to New Clause 10 in my name. But before I get into New Clause 10, I would just take the opportunity to echo a number of voices from across various points of the Chamber in terms of expressing my regret that what we have before us is a narrow bill to ensure compliance with the requirements of CPTPP, rather than having a debate on the substance and the fundamental principle itself. And I would agree that this is something where we could collectively do much better. Now, my party's concerns regarding the impact of the CPTPP rest over the long term. However, if positive impacts are going to be hard to find at this moment in time, it's important to, I would argue, that any negatives that come are identified early and, where possible, mitigated. Now, at committee, the Minister stated the intention that there should be a biennial monitoring report and a comprehensive evaluation report for the whole agreement prepared within 5 years of the UK's accession. And while that is welcome, by that time it might be a little bit late for any sectors which immediately find themselves adversely affected. So we know from the various iterations of post-Brexit agreement over trading arrangements between Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the European single market that even the most carefully negotiated and meticulously scrutinised arrangements, which most of those largely weren't, that there can still be unforeseen adverse consequences which emerge, which require to be addressed. So that's why in New Clause 10 we're calling for what you might refer to as an early warning report, which within 6 months would provide a basis for comparison pre and post CPTPP implementation of any impact that has gone on to have on the UK's trade in goods, services and on GDP. And in that regard, I can just say that if new clause 9 had been selected, we would also have voted for that, to have that baseline of data made available. Now, in terms of the other amendments that are before us on the paper today, from the Scottish National Party perspective, we find merit in all of them. And in particular, and the Right Honourable Member is no longer in his place, but we would have been very happy to offer support for new clause 1 in the name of the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green. I think it's fair to say that at times there appears to be a bit of a disconnect in UK government policy between trade policy and foreign policy. And there's also can be no doubt, surely, that the accession of other states to the CPTPP could potentially present a risk to national security or to other trade or international relations objectives that from time to time His Majesty's government might determine upon. So as such, ensuring that the accession of any economy which has been designated as either a threat or a strategic challenge in the integrated review should be subject to a report by government and a vote in the House of Commons to allow members to express their view seems to us to be the very least that members ought to be entitled to expect. And I listened with interest as the debate ping-ponged across the chamber about how better scrutiny might be applied to trade deals in future. I think that's certainly a valuable debate to have. There's obviously different viewpoints that have been expressed, but in terms of what is passing before us right now, there would have been an opportunity, and I contend that there is still an opportunity with other amendments on the paper to ensure that that sort of level of information can be brought to the House so that members can at least express a view, even if that view is not necessarily binding on the government. Which brings me to new clause 4, which has to some extent, I would say, stolen perhaps the thunder of new clause 1. And we'll be very happy tonight to walk through the lobbies in support of new clause 4, and if successful, we would certainly expect the resulting reports which come out of that to certainly cover the scope of the information that would have been requested had new clause 1 been passed as well. Now, turning now to the ISDS, our concerns over the potential application of investor-state dispute settlements and the absence of side letters of exemption are well known. As we heard from the Right Honourable Member for Birmingham, Hodge Hill, earlier, there are jurisdictions within the CPTPP membership which have a number of pension funds and investors who clearly have significant financial interests around the world, not least in the UK. And I listened carefully at committee to what the Minister said in regards to why he didn't feel it was necessary to have measures such as this in place. And I have to say I remain thoroughly unconvinced by the argument that he put forward that just because the UK had never been subject to a successful action under ISDS, that therefore it was unlikely to do so in the future. The Minister, I assume, has never in his life been run over by a bus, but I presume that he still takes suitable precautions when he's looking both ways to cross the road. And so therefore, I think that this is not a risk that we should be embarking upon in terms of opening up the UK economy to the full scope of ISDS. And had new clause 3 been selected, we would also have been happy to support that, to monitor its implementation. Now, finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, new clause 12, which has been moved by the Honourable Member for Chesham and Amersham. Again, this is something we could support because quite clearly, although it is a narrow bill before us today, the bill is still bringing forward a number of measures which affect performers in the manner in which they are able to assert their rights. And again, I think it's important to understand as quickly as possible the potential, the impact, the practical impact of any unforeseen consequences at this stage. So on that basis, we think it's prudent to have this the measure included with the bill, and we would be happy again to support this amendment also. Thank you.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I rise to move new clauses 4, 5, 6, 7 and Amendment 1 in my name, and I draw the attention of the House to my entry in the Register of Members' Interests in relation to BPI. Let me at the outset, Mr Deputy Speaker, say what a particular pleasure it was to listen to my new honourable friend for Kingswood's maiden speech. In particular, his description of some of the comments of his constituents to him during the by-election will chime with all on this side of the House. What was clear from his maiden speech is that he will be an asset to the House, and I think it's fair to say South London's loss is undoubtedly Kingswood's gain. We support accession to CPTPP, in particular because of its geopolitical benefits, but also for the benefits, relatively limited as they are set to be, for trade. Given that the party opposite have delivered recession, a cost of living crisis and the worst growth rate in the G7, any uptake in trade and ultimately growth, however limited it would be, is welcome. There remain, though, a series of concerns about the government's approach to CPTPP and to trade deals in particular. Our amendments and new clauses seek to address, in particular, the weak arrangements for scrutiny by Parliament of trade deals, the growing concern around the investor-state dispute settlement process, issues around performers' rights, environmental, animal welfare and food standards, and lastly, what help businesses will be offered to exploit the benefits, however limited, of this deal. On new Clause 1, I recognise the concerns articulated by the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green in his speech and amendment, echoed by the Right Honourable Gentleman for North Somerset, and I'm sympathetic to his call for an enhanced role for Parliament. I'm also sympathetic to the Honourable Lady for Chesham and Amersham's new Clause 11, requiring an impact assessment for Parliament on all new countries requesting to join CPTPP. I think, though, Mr Deputy Speaker, we need to go further than both new clauses. Our new Clause 4 requires ministers to publish an impact assessment for Parliament and to give the House a vote on all new countries wanting to join CPTPP. Security issues, the impact on particular sectors of the economy, the impact on jobs in the UK, as well as the opportunities. The British people surely have a right to expect this House to consider the merits or not of all new applicants to CPTPP. The Minister, during the Lord's debate, said he thought a new state joining CPTPP would trigger here in the UK the CRAG process. But the CRAG process, as increasing numbers of members across the House have largely come to agree, is clearly not fit for purpose, PACAC being just the latest committee to make that clear in their recent report. So new Clause 4 today provides the opportunity to reform one part of that process. In passing, let me note, as the Chair of the Select Committee, the Honourable Member for Totnes and my Honourable Friend for Walthamstow noted, we were promised by the Secretary of State and by the Minister in committee that there would be a debate under the CRAG process as opposed to just through this small implementing bill. This we now know isn't going to happen. It's another broken promise on trade. The impacts of new countries joining CPTPP will vary, but could in certain situations be considerable. And it's only right that the country at large should expect this House to consider those impacts carefully. So I do hope the Right Honourable Gentlemen opposite and the Honourable Lady for Chesham and Amersham can be persuaded to support our amendment. It would achieve what they want in practice and go further. And with the leave of the House, we will press that issue. On new Clause 5, I hesitate to damage the reputation of my honourable friends for Brighton, Kemptown and for Hayes and Harlington, who I thought made excellent speeches on ISDS. Over the last 10 years, the marked acceleration in usage of ISDS by large litigious corporations to challenge in particular climate-related or other environmental decisions by governments has prompted concerns at the highest levels in the US, within European capitals and at the UN, so much so that governments across the world are increasingly excluding or revoking ISDS provisions. The problem with ISDS is it is secretive. It avoids perfectly effective domestic public legal systems. It discriminates against small and medium-sized businesses. It often prevents the voice of those with genuine interest in the decisions from being heard, and it holds back potentially environmental and other progressive public policy changes. Strikingly, the OECD could find no sustained evidence that ISDS was key to securing and maintaining business investment. And I noted the Nuffield Trust submission ahead of today's debate that ISDS could enable companies to challenge some health regulations and NHS policies. The US, Canada, the European Union have all taken steps to revoke ISDS provisions in some of their major treaties. And given that the average cost of just the details of published cases of levels of taxpayer monies that governments have been forced to pay out is about $600 million for climate cases, so the concern expressed by the UN Secretary-General's Special Rapporteur on Environment and Human Rights just last September that ISDS was a significant threat to the net zero transition, to the Paris Agreement and tackling climate change seems even more noteworthy. Some in government clearly share some of these concerns, as they wanted to exclude ISDS from the bilateral trade deal with Canada and supported its abolition for trade within the European Union. The Right Honourable Gentleman for Chelsea and Fulham, the Minister in Committee, I have to say was somewhat evasive, initially trying to duck questions on why the government wanted to exclude ISDS from a bilateral trade agreement with Canada, but was quite happy to leave it in CPTPP for Canadian investors still to use. Given that ministers have signed side letters with Australia and New Zealand, as we've heard, to disapply ISDS between our countries in CPTPP, it seems bizarre that ministers should not have attempted a similar approach with Canada. Just after the committee stage, the government confirmed it was pulling out of the Energy Charter Treaty, in which ISDS arrangements play a major role, saying it doesn't fit with net zero ambitions. So perhaps the minister might want to try again at explaining why it is essential that we remain committed to the ISDS elements of CPTPP. We believe it's time for a clear-eyed assessment of the risk ISDS poses to our interests. And again, with the leave of the House, we on these benches will press new Clause 5.2. There continues to be significant concerns about the environmental impact of CPTPP, the impact on food standards and on animal welfare from our accession to CPTPP. It currently includes 2 of the 11 deforestation fronts, expected to account for 80% of deforestation by 2030. A range of environmental groups are very concerned that by the UK joining CPTPP, preferential access to our markets through the removal of tariffs on palm oil could increase demand for products from these threatened zones and exacerbate the risk of further deforestation. With ministers still not having published, never mind presented to this House, deforestation due diligence legislation under Section 17 of the Environment Act, it's difficult to accept ministers' claims to be fully committed to our climate change targets and to protecting important sources of global biodiversity. On food standards, there remain deep concerns that despite their protestations, the deals ministers have negotiated, including CPTPP, will allow ever more food produced to lower standards, particularly on animal welfare, into the UK. And the whole House will remember the words of the former Environment Secretary, who told the House that the Minister and his colleagues had given away far too much for far too little when they negotiated the UK-Australia FTA. The RSPCA and the NFU in particular have raised concerns that new tariffs negotiated with Mexico and Canada will leave farmers in the UK much more vulnerable to imported eggs, pork and chicken that are produced to standards that would be illegal in the UK. The Pesticides Action Network have raised concerns acknowledged by the Trade and Agriculture Commission, and my honourable friend raised them too behind me, that more food produced using pesticides banned in the UK will be imported into the UK. New Clause 7 would require ministers to publish a plan to help businesses benefit from this new trade deal. It is striking that the OBR, in their recent budget analysis, made clear that trade will make a negligible contribution to growth through to 2028, under the plans of the party opposite. We remember the Secretary of State was appointed, and within weeks, exports began to fall. Then the Minister of State was reappointed to the brief, and exports have fallen even further. Who, Mr. Deputy Speaker, could possibly have expected that to happen? Ministers have cut funding for trade missions led by business groups themselves. They've cut funding for SMEs to get to trade shows to open up new markets for themselves. And the government website to help exporters is so poor some firms use other countries' websites to find where there might be opportunities. Ministers could and should be doing a whole lot better to support our businesses take advantage of any benefits in trade deals. Our new clause would require ministers to publish a clear implementation plan once the accession process is over, to help businesses benefit from CPTPP. Preference utilisation rates for other trade deals certainly don't offer any grounds for complacency. Given that exports under the party opposite have performed worse than every other member of the G7 bar Japan over the last decade, it was striking that the Chancellor had nothing to offer exporters and strikingly no mention of any plan to help British business exploit our coming membership of CPTPP in his recent budget. For these reasons, I'm sympathetic to the new clause tabled by the Honourable Member for Gordon too. On Amendment 1, as the Minister knows, and as the Honourable Lady for Chesham and Amersham set out too, there remain serious doubts from industry as to whether the changes the bill allows for in relation to the UK's copyright framework are actually required. We've had different explanations from ministers for these changes. At one point they were due to CPTPP, on another occasion they were being made to comply with other international treaty obligations signed decades ago. What is clear is that these changes could have a significant impact on the ability of the music industry to support new British artists. Ministers were forced, because of those concerns, to bring forward a consultation on the changes. It's a consultation that won't be finished until after the bill's passage through both houses has been completed. In the worst-case scenario estimated by the Intellectual Property Office, the changes could cost over £100 million. It's likely that royal assent will have been granted, Mr Deputy Speaker, before we know the outcome of the consultation process. Ministers were forced to bring forward this issue, and I have to say it's just the latest example of an at best half-hearted approach to scrutiny by the Treasury bench opposite on trade issues. Reform of the UK... I will be waiting.
He's making an excellent speech, but he well, he knows it anyway, but there's nothing wrong with praising. But is it not also a sign, particularly of our creative industries, how the government time and time again lets them down? If this was steel or if this was farming, they would be in the ear of the ministers through their trade partnership committees. But creative industries are locked out of many of them and they are ignored. And that's why Labour has put forward a plan to put creative industries at the heart of our economic development.
Well, I think my honourable friend was generous in his description of my speech. I'm grateful to him for that, and absolutely right about the importance of Labour's plan for the creative sector. Reform of the UK's copyright framework should not be taken lightly, Mr Deputy Speaker, and should only follow proper and well-considered consultation, surely. Otherwise, we risk endangering our gold standard of protection for our vital creative sector. I gently suggest to the House that the reforms allowed for under Clause 5 of the bill should not have been shoehorned into this bill, and certainly not without a thorough consultation having taken place first. In that regard, we are sympathetic to the merits of new Clause 12, tabled by the Honourable Lady for Chesham and Amersham. We will continue to scrutinise developments in the area, and we hope that ministers will come to a final decision after the consultation that won't have the adverse impact some outside this House fear. On both new Clause 2 and 3, tabled by my honourable friend for Brighton Kemptown, as I've indicated, I share his concerns, and I hope he will join us, therefore, with enthusiasm in the lobby later. Similarly, I share my right honourable friend for Hayes and Harlington's desire to see much greater adherence to the conventions on the ILO. We raised this issue too in committee, and as I indicated earlier too, I share his frustration, along with those of other members of the House, that ministers have not allowed the House a substantive debate under the CRAG process.
On that point, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for making such an excellent speech, and he is right to underline this point about ILO obligations, because, of course, in the 2022 Queen's speech, we were promised an update to the Modern Slavery Act that would have required much stronger action and transparency on supply chains to eliminate forced labour. That measure appears to have disappeared, and so we've got to insist now on more robust action in our trade agreements to wipe out the scandal of modern slavery.
Well, I think my right honourable friend is absolutely right. One hopes that ministers have certainly heard his point. Whether they will act on it remains to be seen, but I certainly hope they do. And we, if we are lucky enough to be elected at the next general election, will certainly work with the ILO to try and drive better adherence to their conventions. Lastly, but not least, on my honourable friend for Walthamstow's excellent and powerful speech, I share very much her ambition for a much more open dialogue on trade and to axe more of the red tape, bureaucracy and barriers to trade with our European markets thrown up by the poor negotiating skills of the last Prime Minister but two. There remain, in particular, serious concerns, Mr Deputy Speaker, about scrutiny of trade agreements and about the damage ISDS provisions could do. So we will, with the leave of the House, hope to press these two new clauses in particular to a vote.
Minister for Trade, Greg Hands.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd like to thank colleagues for their contributions to the debates on this important bill. Turning to the amendments before us on new accessions to CPTPP, I will begin with amendments New Clause 1, New Clause 4 and New Clause 11, tabled by my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green, who always demonstrates his passion on this important matter, and the honourable members for Harrow West and Chesham and Amersham, respectively. As the House may be aware, there is actually no rule within CPTPP that requires new applicants to be dealt with on a first-come, first-served basis. Rather, it has been agreed within the group that applicant economies must meet three important criteria called the Auckland Principles, and it is on these key principles that applications to CPTPP will be assessed. They must first be willing and able to meet the high standards of the CPTPP agreement. Second, they must have demonstrated a pattern of complying with their trade commitments. And third, Mr Deputy Speaker, they must be able to command consensus of the CPTPP parties. So these are strong criteria that will be applied to each accession application. As a new member of the CPTPP group, it is right that we in the United Kingdom work within the principles of the group to achieve a consensus decision. I'd like to remind the House that the UK rightly participates in discussions on this topic with CPTPP parties, but we will only have a formal say over an application post-ratification and entry into force of the agreement. It is therefore, Mr Deputy Speaker, crucial that we ratify this agreement and become a party so that we can work with CPTPP members decisively on each current and future application. With this in mind, it would not be appropriate for the government to give a running commentary on individual applicants, not least as to be drawn on individual applicants now, ahead of the UK becoming a party itself to the agreement, could impact our ability to achieve that important goal of ensuring CPTPP enters into force. I also want to be clear that our own accession process, Mr Deputy Speaker, set a strong precedent. The robust experience the UK has been through has reinforced the high standards and proved the bar is not easy to meet for any aspirant. Regarding the scrutiny of any hypothetical future accession, I can assure the House that any accession of a new party to CPTPP would require an amendment to the terms of the CPTPP. Therefore, as with the UK's accession protocol, our firm intention is that such a future accession would be subject to the terms of the Constitutional Reform and Governance CRAG Act 2010, the CRAG process. I want to assure the House that CRAG is applicable to plurilateral agreements such as CPTPP. The Act makes no distinction between bilateral, plurilateral or multilateral treaties as outlined in Section 25 of CRAG. Of course.
So he's being characteristically generous in giving way. We obviously sought a debate under CRAG for this treaty. The Secretary of State, who's now in her place, said to our committee that she supported that. The Leader of the House then refused to make the time, in government time, in order to have the debate. So what further assurances could he give us that there would indeed be a debate if the treaty was changed in the way that he described?
Mr Speaker, the government's position here is unchanged, that it's always the desire of the government, as expressed by the Secretary of State in writing to the House and to him as chair of the Select Committee, to urge and to ask for there to be a debate, but it's always going to be subject to the availability of parliamentary time. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm going to come on in a little bit to discuss the opportunities that there have been to scrutinise CPTPP, Mr Deputy Speaker, which have been manifold in recent years. So the Act makes no distinction, I'll give way a little bit later, between bilateral, plurilateral and multilateral treaties. So in addition to Parliament being able to make its views clear through the CRAG process, let me remind the House that as a dualist state, any legislation necessary to implement the treaty, to take a hypothetical example, such as alterations to tariffs legislation, would need to be fully scrutinised and passed by Parliament in the usual way. It is the long-standing policy of His Majesty's Government not to ratify international agreements before all relevant domestic legislation is in place. Were Parliament to refuse to pass any necessary implementing legislation, this would delay ratification of an agreement. I'd like to thank, Mr Deputy Speaker, both my right honourable friends, the members for Chingford and Woodford Green and North Somerset, for their opening speeches in this debate. Both are very strong supporters of the UK joining CPTPP. Indeed, my right honourable friend, the former Secretary of State and member for North Somerset, initiated these talks back in 2017 with me at his side, which successive Secretary of States have given huge and maximum priority to doing so. I'm now, Mr Deputy Speaker, in my fourth stint in this role, and it's fantastic to see his and my vision in 2017 now nearing fruition, being very close to UK ratification. To my right honourable friend for Chingford, he and I know that Parliament is perfectly capable of expressing a view on an international agreement and whether a country might join it, and the government of the day would be very likely to take notice. Over debates in this House over some years now, he has made his views on trade with China clear and has gained support and attention and been effective in doing so. Indeed, he has helped achieve changes in policy in relation to supply chains in Xinjiang, and I agree with his support for Taiwan, which is a full member of the World Trade Organization, as being an important trade partner for the UK. So we are positive about the debate in this House and this kind of debate. The right honourable member for Hodge Hill, Chairman of the Select Committee, I'll just say to him, in terms of the scrutiny that there has been in this House, Mr Deputy Speaker, for the CPTPP agreement, and he doubted whether there had been 4 debates. And I checked back, because I had a slightly nagging memory, Mr Deputy Speaker, that I may actually remember each of the 4 debates. So I have gone back and checked the 4 debates, which started the very first one, which I responded to in April 2021. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, there have been 4 debates in this House and in the other House on CPTPP. There have been 2 oral ministerial statements. There have been 16 written ministerial statements. There have been 5 separate select committees have taken evidence from ministers and senior officials on this. There has been a TAC report. There has been a Section 42 report. Mr Deputy Speaker, this is not an under-scrutinised trade agreement, rather the opposite. And has always been clear, we want CPTPP to expand to fast-growing Asia-Pacific economies, and I also agree with the Auckland principles. Of course I'll give way if he concedes first that this has been a well-scrutinised trade deal.
Not quite. I'm grateful for the Minister, however, setting out the full history, but will he accept that his right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, believed that we should be having a debate under the CRAG principles on the full treaty? This bill only covers 3 of 30 treaties. It is a matter of disappointment to many of us in the House that even though the Secretary of State no doubt argued vigorously and passionately the debate, the Leader of the House was unable to grant us time. That's not necessarily the precedent that we want to establish for further trade treaty scrutiny.
Minister. Mr Speaker, of course, he was a minister in the last Labour government, and he will remember that there are the vagaries of time available, and making an application saying we would like there to be a debate is not the same thing as those who run the parliamentary timetable as agreeing to there being one. So let me move on to the maiden speech by the new member for Kingswood, who I thought made a very accomplished and well-delivered speech. He spoke fondly of predecessors that I also know and like Roger Berry and Rob Hayward, and he won a keenly contested by-election. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I've been to a few by-elections in recent years, and I was grateful to be given a little bit of time off to not go to Kingswood. But nonetheless, great admiration for those who win by-elections. I've seen them at close hand. What a very different kind of contest that they are. He spoke of his support for free trade. He spoke of his support for rewards for hard work, sympathy for the government facing the challenges of COVID and Ukraine. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I agree with him on all of those, and the government does too, and I look forward to him continuing the tradition of an independent-minded member for Kingswood, but please don't necessarily tell the Labour Whip's office. My honourable friend, the member for Totnes, as ever, passionate about trade, passionate about CPTPP, and always probing on those issues as well. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there have been various amendments tabled which ask for additional impact assessments. Before addressing some of these amendments directly, I'd like to again provide reassurance to the House that the Government will publish a biennial monitoring report and a comprehensive evaluation report of the agreement within 5 years of our succession. Turning to specific amendments, Amendments 1 and New Clause 12 would introduce commitments to publish impact assessments on the performers' rights provisions in this bill. I will set out, Mr. Deputy Speaker, why we consider these amendments to be unnecessary. The impacts of the rules depend in large part on how they are applied in particular cases through secondary legislation made under the Copyright Designs and Patents Act 1988, or the CDPA. That secondary legislation may restrict or extend particular rights to particular countries. Wherever the government tends to make significant changes to the secondary legislation, we will engage with affected industries and carry out an impact assessment. The Intellectual Property Office, or the IPO, has done this recently with its consultation and impact assessment on potential secondary legislation on the broadcasting and public playing of recorded music. I think a commitment to assess the impacts of the measures in this bill is therefore unnecessary and risks overlooking the effects of the secondary legislation. I will now turn to Amendments New Clause 2 and New Clause 6, which broadly focus on the environment and other standards. I can provide assurance the UK will continue to uphold our high environment standards in respect of all of our trade agreements, including CPTPP. As I previously mentioned, the Government intends to publish a comprehensive ex-post evaluation for the agreement within 5 years of the UK's accession. And I can confirm this evaluation will include an assessment of the environmental impacts of our accession. In addition, the Independent Trade and Agriculture Commission was asked to scrutinise the UK's accession protocol and produce a report. And the TAC concluded in their advice, published on the 7th of December 2023, that, quote, CPTPP does not require the UK to change its level of statutory protection in relation to the aforementioned areas. The Government, of course I will.
It's very welcome that there will be a review report. Will that report include the numbers of unsustainable palm oil and rainforest wood to ensure that we are not exploiting more than we are at the moment, just in the 5-year report?
Mr. Speaker, that's exactly the sort of thing that I would expect the report to do. But that report I'm looking at 2 or 5 years. But I must say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm delighted that he's mentioned the government's record when it comes to palm oil. Because 86% of UK imports of palm oil were certified as sustainable in 2022, up from 16% under the last Labour government in 2010 when we took office. And the deforestation related to palm oil in Malaysia has fallen by 60% since 2012 in the latest available figures. And we will keep working with countries like Malaysia to build on that work. So the government will be laying its forest risk commodities legislation under the Environment Act as soon as parliamentary time allows, which will make it illegal for larger businesses operating in the UK to use key forest risk commodities produced on land illegally occupied or used. The government has confirmed that palm oil products would be included under the regulated commodities. And additionally, I once again refer, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to the report of the Independent Trade and Agriculture Commission, which concluded that it is, quote, unlikely that CPTPP will lead to an increase in palm oil being grown on deforested land. On ISDS, moving to Amendments New Clause 3 and New Clause 5, the UK's accession to CPTPP will benefit UK investors. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I don't think the opposition understand how business works. We support British businesses operating overseas. They create jobs in this country, jobs that the Labour Party does not seem to like.
On that point,
for the first, of course.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for progressing CPTP with all his usual energy, because it's boosting trade, huge strategic significance, and an opportunity of Brexit that must be grasped. On investor state dispute resolution, he's absolutely right. We not give way to the naysayers, because it is overwhelmingly in UK interests, given the protections for UK businesses and exporters and the certainty it provides in the massive growth region of the Indo-Pacific.
My right honourable friend for that intervention. He was actually also played a really important role in getting CPTPP through. I remember our joint visit to Vietnam in 2021, arguing again for Vietnamese support. He is quite right, Mr Deputy Speaker. It is important to remember the UK has never lost an ISDS case. But equally, it is important for us to protect UK businesses operating abroad. They provide jobs at home, they secure livelihoods at home. And that is something which I find astonishing, that the opposition, as they lurch ever leftwards, Mr Deputy Speaker, that they seem to forget the whole time. So I can assure the House that the UK already has investment agreements containing ISDS provisions with around 90 trading partners, and this includes 7 of the 11 CPTPP parties. The UK provides a welcoming investment environment with a non-discriminatory regime, strong rule of law and good governance. We are clear that where we negotiate ISDS, we will not hinder our inherent right to regulate in the public interest, including in areas such as environment and labour standards. Mr Deputy Speaker, I turn to amendments New Clause 7, New Clause 9, New Clause 10 and New Clause 13, which focused on the impacts this deal will have on our businesses and our economy. This government wants UK businesses to benefit from the ambitious provisions in the CPTPP as far as possible after we succeed, and is working to raise awareness of the agreement and ensure businesses have the knowledge they need to take advantage of the opportunities CPTPP will present when it enters into force in the UK. I now turn to Amendment New Clause 8, tabled by the Right Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington, which focuses on labour standards. I noticed there was not an official Labour amendment focusing on labour standards, Mr Deputy Speaker. Maybe Labour don't care about labour anymore, but I know the Right Honourable Gentleman does. And the CPTPP Labour chapter includes binding provisions on fundamental labour rights and on hours of work, health and safety and minimum wages. The Labour chapter reaffirms CPTPP parties' obligations as members of the ILO and requires that parties do not waive or derogate from their domestic labour laws in order to encourage trade or investment. Turning to Amendment 2, also tabled by the Right Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington, which relates to conformity assessment regulations referenced in the bill. The amendment would only allow changes to conformity assessment regulations following a motion to resolve against the ratification of the UK accession protocol first. Now here, I just think it would be unwise for us to pass that kind of an amendment to resolve against the ratification of UK accession in advance. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, this has been a wide-ranging debate. We have debated important issues. I particularly wanted to minute my thanks to my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green, who raises quite rightly important questions around our trade with China, and also to other right honourable friends who have supported the process of the UK acceding to CPTPP. And finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, I don't want to tempt fate, but this might be my last occasion to speak on our CPTPP accession in this House before the UK formally ratifies joining CPTPP. Mr Deputy Speaker, I passionately believe, and I think this whole government passionately believes, that CPTPP offers a great future for the UK, and I've seen through our accession from it being a novel idea in 2017 through to ratification and hopeful accession in 2024. Not many of us in this place have been able to do that over a 7-year period, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I am grateful to all of my ministerial colleagues, successive Prime Ministers who have supported CPTPP, and my excellent DIT and DBT officials for being with me on this very exciting journey. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
New Clause 1 has been moved. Sir Iain Duncan Smith, is it your... I understand it's your wish to withdraw it, is that correct? Is it your pleasure that New Clause 1 be withdrawn? Aye. New Clause 1 by leave withdrawn. New Clause 4 has been selected for a separate decision. Gareth Thomas to move New Clause 4 formally. question is that...
Session of new states to the CPTPP.
Beg your pardon. New clause 4, the question is that new clause 4 be read a second time. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no.
No.
Division, clear the lobbies. You think I'd have learnt by now? Is that new clause 4 be read a second time? Many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Somebody say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Samantha Dixon, Gerald Jones. Tellers for the noes, Amanda Milling and Ruth Edwards. Order.
The ayes to the right, 224. The noes to the left, 301.
The ayes to the right, 224. The noes to the left, 301. So the noes have it. Unlock. New clause 5 has been selected for separate decision. Gareth Thomas to move new clause 5 formally.
Formally.
The question is that new clause 5 be read a second time. Order! The question is that new clause 5 be read a second time. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. Division. Clear the lobbies. Is that new clause 5 be read a second time? Aye. Aye. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Samantha Dixon and Gerald Jones. Tellers for the noes, Amanda Milling and Ruth Edwards. Order, order.
The ayes to the right, 217. The noes to the left, 305.
Thank you. The ayes to the right, 217. The noes to the left, 305. The noes have it. Unlock. New clause 10 has been selected for separate decision. Richard Thomson to move new clause 10 for.
Move formally.
Report on economic impact of implementation of CPTPP.
The question is that new clause 10 be read a second time. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. Division, clear the lobbies. Is that new clause 10 be read a second time? As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. Tell us for the ayes, Peter Grant and Kirsty Blackman. Tell us for the noes, Amanda Milling and Ruth Edwards. Order.
The ayes to the right, 218. The noes to the left, 305.
Thank you. The ayes to the right, 218. The noes to the left, 305. So the noes have it. Unlock. New clause 12 has been selected for separate decision. Sarah Green to move new clause 12 formally.
Move formally. Impact assessment, UK performers' rights.
The question is that new clause 12 be read a second time. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. Division. Clear the lobbies. Is that new clause 12 be read a second time? Many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. Tell us for the ayes, Samantha Dixon and Gerald Jones. Tell us for the noes, Amanda Milling and Ruth Edwards. Order, order.
The ayes to the right, 219. The noes to the left, 306.
The ayes to the right were 219. The noes to the left were 306. So the noes have it. Unlock. Consideration completed. Third reading.
Now.
Minister to move third reading.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that the bill be now read a third time. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'd like to thank members across this House and noble lords in the other place for the interest they have shown in this legislation throughout its passage. This bill may be narrow in scope, but the underlying agreement it relates to and the benefits it could bring for British business, the British economy, and the British people are wide-ranging. By acceding to the comprehensive and progressive agreements for Trans-Pacific Partnership, we will strengthen our ties with some of the world's most dynamic economies and gain greater access to the Indo-Pacific region, one which will account for the majority of global growth and around half of the world's middle-class consumers in the decades to come. Crucially, acceding to CPTPP will mean improved market access for UK exporters in existing CPTPP parties, including Malaysia and Brunei, our very first free trade deal with these fast-growing economies. In turn, this partnership will simplify supply chains and cut costs for innovative firms based here in the UK. Firms like Wrightbus, a long-established, family-owned Northern Ireland bus manufacturer. They will benefit from opportunities to import parts at lower tariffs from Malaysia. We have also agreed with Malaysia more liberal rules of origin, making it simpler for British brands like Jaguar Land Rover to export British-designed, British-made vehicles to that market at lower tariffs. Our future accession, however, will not just be good for businesses selling their products abroad, it will be good for consumers here at home. It could provide consumers with wider choice and cheaper prices at the supermarket checkout on everything from Chilean and Peruvian fruit juices to honey and chocolate from Mexico. Inward investment in the UK by CPTPP parties will be encouraged when we accede to building on some £182 billion of investment in job-creating projects we saw in 2021 alone. Now, as honourable members will know, this is a bill that affects the whole of the UK. Clause 3 and the parts of the schedule relating to government procurement engage the Sewell Convention. So we have sought legislative consent from the Scottish Parliament, the Senate and Northern Ireland Assembly. I want to reassure honourable members that there has been regular engagement with the devolved administrations before introduction and throughout the bill's passage at both ministerial and official level. And I want to thank the devolved administration's ministers and their teams for working so constructively with us. It is in part thanks to their efforts that the Scottish Parliament passed a legislative consent motion in February of this year. The Welsh Government published a legislative consent motion on 5th of March and recommended consent be granted to Clause 3 and relevant parts of the schedule. Due to a misstep during the moving and consideration of the motion, legislative consent was not granted to Clause 3 and relevant parts of the schedule. I understand that there are plans for a further Senate vote regarding legislative consent for Clause 3 and relevant parts of the schedule. However, in the event a further vote is not scheduled in the Senate before royal assent, the UK Government will proceed with this bill without consent from Wales. Members will know that the Northern Ireland Assembly was adjourned when this bill was introduced in November last year. This prevented us from seeking legislative consent at that time. However, my department has engaged with Northern Ireland officials throughout this period, providing them with updates as the bill has progressed through Parliament. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank the Minister for that very positive response from all the regions of the United Kingdom, and it's good to have that. In the discussions that the Honourable Lady has had with the Northern Ireland Assembly, has there been an opportunity to engage with some of the business life in Northern Ireland, which has been holding things together, and also the Ulster Farmers Union? I know the Secretary of State is always very energetic when it comes to pursuing those matters, but I think it's important that we have that reassurance. Thanks very much.
The Honourable Gentleman raises a very good point, and he is quite right. The Minister for Trade Policy has had the engagement which he referenced, and in fact, upon the return of the Northern Ireland Assembly, my right honourable friend, the Minister for Trade Policy, wrote to the Minister for Finance at the earliest opportunity to request legislative consent. I am grateful the Minister agreed with the bill's devolution analysis and, in principle, to begin the legislative consent process. Nevertheless, we still face a challenging timeline and a pressing need for this bill to complete its passage. This is vital to allow for secondary legislation to be made and for ratification of the UK's accession protocol. As such, we cannot delay passage of the bill to allow the Northern Ireland Executive and Northern Ireland Assembly greater time to consider legislative consent. This would jeopardise all of the current ratification timelines. Mr Deputy Speaker, I recognise that the legislative consent process is normally concluded before the last amending stage in the Second House. Given the timing of the return of the Northern Ireland Assembly, this has obviously been extremely challenging, but I believe it is still right that we allow the Northern Ireland Executive and Assembly as much time as we can to consider our request. In the event that legislative consent is not granted by the Northern Ireland Assembly before the deadline for royal assent, we will still have to proceed. Failing to do so would compromise the commitments that we have made in our accession protocol. Mr Deputy Speaker, at second reading of this bill, I outlined the wealth of benefits that will come with the UK's accession to the CPTPP, the growth-spurring and business-boosting effect it will have on our economy. Since that time, we have had some spirited and worthwhile debates. I would particularly like to thank the Honourable Member for Harrow West and the Honourable Member for Gordon for the constructive manner in which they have scrutinised this legislation. I also commend those members that sat on its bill committee, including my Honourable friend the Member for Shipley and the Honourable Member for Ealing Central and Acton, who showed their great expertise as chairs. I'd also like to thank my right honourable friend and Minister of State for Trade Policy, the Member for Chelsea and Fulham, for expertly shepherding this legislation through the House with his consummate skill and good humour and delivering what appears to be a clean bill. I will let members review Hansard, of course, to see how many times my right honourable friend reminded the honourable member for Harrow West that he voted for Cragg. I think I heard that quite a lot throughout the debates. It would be remiss of me, Mr Speaker, to not also mention a number of other members by name for their valued input throughout the bill's passage, including my honourable friend, the member for Totnes, whose second reading speech and interventions made an excellent case, not just for UK accession to CPTPP, but also the benefits of free trade more generally. I am also grateful to my honourable friend for highlighting the scrutiny provided by the recent Trade and Agricultural Commission report on the UK's agreement to accede to CPTPP, a report that stated that CPTPP does not require the UK to change its levels of statutory protection in relation to animal or plant life for health, animal welfare or environmental protection. At second reading, we also heard useful insights from several of the Prime Minister's trade envoys, notably my honourable friends for Wyre Forest, Gloucester and Cleethorpes, as well as the honourable member for Liverpool Walton. The right honourable member for Birmingham Hodge Hill, who as chair of the Business and Trade Select Committee, brought a critical eye to bear on aspects of the underlying agreement, around which I hope he has now been reassured. My honourable friend, the member for Penrith and the Border, rightly championed the UK's high food and animal welfare standards that this government will continue to protect, and my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green, who demonstrated his well-honed ability to probe legislation with regards to the future potential accessions of economies to the CPTPP. The Business and Trade Select Committee, more broadly, has my thanks for its engagement with and scrutiny of this important bill. Mr Deputy Speaker, this legislation will help ensure that the UK meets its international obligations upon accession to the CPTPP. When the bill achieves royal assent, it will mean we have put the UK at the heart of a dynamic group of countries in the Indo-Pacific, providing new opportunities for British companies to sell more of their high-quality goods and services to a market of over 500 million people with a combined GDP of 9 trillion. With that in mind, and in the hope that it will therefore garner support from all honourable and right honourable members, I am pleased to commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read the third time. Gareth Thomas.
Mr Deputy Speaker, we support the UK's accession to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. Despite the concerns we've raised during the bill's stages, we have not stood in the way of its passage through this House thus far, and we do not intend to try and divide the House at third reading either. We recognise the geopolitical benefits and the economic benefits, limited nonetheless as they are likely to be in the near future. During committee, we outlined a series of concerns about the inclusion of provisions for investor-state dispute settlement and its implications for the NHS, the environment and workers' rights. We raised two concerns about performers' rights and why on earth the government chose to launch a consultation on these provisions after this bill was already making its way through Parliament. Talk about putting the cart before the horse. We also raised environmental concerns, probing ministers about deforestation, palm oil, increased carbon emissions, the use of pesticides, threats to indigenous wildlife, and the undermining of the UK's commitment to combating climate change and preserving biodiversity. The Secretary of State promised us a debate on CPTPP under the CRAG process to the Business Committee. We were promised by the Minister in committee a debate under CRAG as well on CPTPP, which has not happened. I say this gently to them both. Sadly, it is one more example of ministers ducking scrutiny of the trade deals they sign. It's almost as if they have something to hide. We have been grateful in particular to the TUC, Chester Zoo, the World Wildlife Federation, the Trade Justice Movement, Transform Trade, the NFU and the RSPCA and the Alliance for Intellectual Property for their help in ensuring we understood in full the implications of this bill. I am grateful for their generosity with time and expertise. One can't help feeling that had the government initiated a thorough consultation exercise much earlier in proceedings, before CPTPP was a done deal, that we might have come out of the negotiations as less of a rule taker and with a better deal for the UK. Better consultation with the nations and regions could have happened throughout the whole of the CPTPP process, but both the Scottish and Welsh governments lamented poor communication at key stages from ministers. Hopefully, lessons have been learnt. We will all have to take the opportunity of the CPTPP review in 2026 to look at what more can be achieved. I'd like to thank all members of the Public Bill Committee, in particular my fellow Shadow Minister, the member for Slough, for his invaluable contributions, help and support during the passage of this bill, as well as the members for the City of Chester, the members for Cardiff North, the members for Reading East and the member for Hammersmith for their time and commitment to that part of the scrutiny process. But also to those across the House at second reading, committee and report stage and in the Lords who have joined in the hard yards, the necessary work of scrutinising what is a key trade arrangement. I thank the Minister of State too for his particularly generous description of me in committee, which might surprise one or two as a serial rebel. I thank him and indeed the Secretary of State too for their contributions, their other contributions, some of which have been helpful. I hope the dialogue, in particular on UPOV and on performers' rights, will continue, and I thank the ministers for their letters to me on these issues. The UK joining the CPTPP will not make up for the government's failure to deliver a good trade deal with Europe, or the party opposite's broken manifesto commitment that 80% of the world would be covered by new trade agreements, including a trade deal with India, which the Secretary of State herself said this month is highly unlikely to happen anytime soon. We remain in the dark as to whether we will ever be tasked with scrutinising a UK-Canada trade deal, or whether negotiations are indeed ongoing, as the Minister says, or not, as the Canadians say. What we do know is that whilst the government have made some outlandish claims about the benefits of the UK joining CPTPP, as the OBR have set out, CPTPP is likely to lead to just a slight increase in GDP in the long run. With exports having dropped last year, set to drop further this year, and the 3 following years of anaemic growth in exports, even the smallest opportunity for growth is welcome. This bill, Mr Deputy Speaker, is needed to implement the CPTPP agreement into domestic legislation, and that is something we don't oppose. There are benefits to joining, and despite reservations, we certainly welcome the opportunities that will be opened up for some British businesses. So for those reasons, as I said, we will not stand in the way of the bill completing its passage through Parliament tonight.
Therese Coffey.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to contribute to the third reading of this debate. Now, I must admit, Mr Deputy Speaker, I had hoped that we would be closer to the moment of interruption, and because there is further business which I already spoke to earlier in the Delegated Legislation Committee regarding energy strategy, but even I do not want to test the patience of the House to speak for the best part of an hour. However, one of the aspects that I do want to stress, though, in this consideration is that this is a truly monumental moment for the United Kingdom. Having left the European Union, we are in a situation where we are really putting our flag around the world and making sure that we drive free trade. Because what is right to believe, and is in all evidence, is free trade is good for this country and it's good for prosperity right around the world. There is a sad element that I have about having, in terms of the time when we're in the European Union and some of the trade agreements that were happening, what seemed to happen is that some of the poorest countries in the world were being deprived of a proper relationship. And by that, I'm referring to the fact that we've seen the trend of it's still only sub-Saharan African nations that truly are exceptionally poor. And unfortunately, it felt at times, due to EU protectionism, that a lot of the prosperity was being deprived from those countries, and we now have the opportunity to branch out on our own in that regard. In terms of African nations, we should remember that a lot of these are our brothers and sisters in the Commonwealth. And I can understand that, of course, the World Trade Organization regulations there apply to everybody. It is important that we try and factor in what it is that we can do to get wealth to many nations as possible. Because I say it would be good for this country and good for elsewhere around the country. Now, the Honourable Member for Harrow East talked about no consultation. Actually, this journey started in 2018 in terms of a consultation. I think it was initiated when my right honourable friend, the member for North Somerset, was the Trade Secretary at the time. And indeed, my right honourable friend, South West Norfolk, Berwick-upon-Tweed, and indeed the person who really cemented the deal, my right honourable friend, the member for Saffron Walden, has really taken us on this journey. And it's one that, in particular, we should give credit to the Prime Minister for his really proactive approach in thinking about trade, but also red lines that he was prepared to put in terms of what our farmers try to do, recognising that we have some of the best farming and best food production in the world. And these red lines were not, again, trying to be protectionist, but about reasonable standards in terms of prosperity of our nation, but also to try and make sure that there was a two-way street. And what I will say is that in my time in DEFRA as Secretary of State, this really matters, and I'm conscious of some of the discussions that happened, and I appreciate these trade negotiations. It can seem frustrating that we're ratifying this afterwards, but I can assure the House that it was absolutely imperative that we got our balance right in terms of values, in terms of the red lines, and I again pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for Saffron Walden, and the Prime Minister in securing what was a really good deal. Now, in terms of one of the things that I think is important is that we need to take advantage of this treaty, and I believe that there are certainly far more agricultural attaches now, and it's important that people don't just focus on what might come into this country and what are imports and what that means about standards. Actually, we have been very strong on the standards agreed in this particular treaty. And in fact, we have more problem with the fact that there aren't the same level of animal welfare standards across the European Union. And we need to work on that as part of our ongoing relationship in regards to the free trade agreement we have there. I know that there are other factors that people are concerned about. Production costs elsewhere are a lot cheaper in some of the 11 countries or 11 other member states of this treaty. And indeed, we do have things like the living wage, but we also have access to grants. We have access to things like robotic milking machines, something I never thought I'd see, but actually does work exceptionally well, and I saw it in practice in the Great Yorkshire Show last year. But I think one of the key measures that was brought in through the Agriculture Act 2020 was done to validate the concerns that people had. And that's why I want to pay tribute to the Trade and Agriculture Commission, who produced a pretty hefty report after their initial terms of reference. And It started going in July 23 and their report was published in December 23. And that is designed specifically to cover issues on environmental protection, animal or plant life or health, and animal welfare. And I think it is, for those who have not read it, it would be worthwhile reading for people to do so. And the key questions that my right honourable friend asked is, does CPTPP require the UK to change its levels of statutory protection in all these different things? And it's basically saying no. We don't need to. And in fact, WTO rules mean that we can keep our statutory protections in many of these areas, in fact, in all of these areas. And we didn't need to, there was no impact on our ability to adopt statutory protections in the future and to maintain the ones that we have. And that really matters because at the time, other nations and, dare I say, environmental groups here were trying to bring lots of different elements into this. And as I said, I won't be keeping the House for as long as perhaps I had originally intended. But things like whether it's about Malaysian palm oil, whether it was about aspects hormone beef and similar, absolutely no way would the United Kingdom be allowing that sort of product into this country. And that's as it, we certainly made sure that was no red line. Now, I'm conscious that the House is not going to, this will go through at third reading. But I do want to simply say a few extra things in terms of some of the aspects that the NFU raised. And I think it is really important that we take, in effect, seriously, that when we said that we would look at all these standards when we went into new trade deals, that the Commission did their job and did a very thorough job. And I want to commend them on having done that. And the NFU would like us to go even further in terms of domestic production standards. It's important that we are now part of this global treaty, and we should not be seeking, or we did not seek, to require others to go and re-ratify the laws in their country by adding elements. Well, I know that all these member states are already part of various international conventions when it comes to the environment, and it's important that we now have new allies as we take this step forward on trying to increase trade, that we make sure that we also can share our learning, share our understanding, show how that adds value. And I genuinely believe that when we start to increase significantly the amount of particularly agricultural products that we send to other parts of the world and through this treaty, then that will really show on why it is that those foods can be done at a premium. Now, I was very fortunate in my time in government to be able to visit some of the countries in the CPTPP. I guess most relevant, most recently, it was visiting Vietnam. And that, again, is important on how we make sure that good standards are in place and why we want to make sure that these are our friends for the future. Several of these countries are already in the G20, they're in the Commonwealth, and we have some new friends there. And it's important that we continue to respect that rather than at times it feels diminish what other countries do in terms of their way of taking trade forward. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I did say that I'm not planning to speak for an hour, much to the joy, I'm sure, of people in this chamber. But in that regard, I want to fully endorse this treaty. It is good for our farmers. It is good for our country in terms of making sure we can also reduce tariffs on a number of products, including those that can be onshored and be put into our free ports, for example, so that we can try and make sure that we increase the value of some of the manufacturing that we do. And Mr Deputy Speaker, I wish this treaty well, and as I say, all the trade and prosperity that will come from that for the United Kingdom, but also for people around the world.
Richard Thomson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I take this opportunity at third reading to thank the clerks for all the assistance that they've given throughout the scrutiny process, and also to offer a heartfelt thanks to the researchers that support my group in terms of the support that they've been able to give to me personally throughout the passage of this bill. The Treasury bench will no doubt be delighted to hear that we also will not be seeking to divide the House on this. We've never said that there couldn't be advantage from the CPTPP, but what we couldn't be clearer about is that we feel it offers a poor substitute for the trade deals that were left behind as a result of leaving the European Union. Now, let's remind ourselves, in the CPTPP, we've essentially swapped the four freedoms of the European single market a market of 500 million consumers right on our doorstep, for an agreement with a combined economy of almost half the size of the opposite side of the world, which currently takes only 8% of our exports. And it really does seem to be a little bit like putting an elastoplast on an amputation by comparison. The government's own impact assessment, which I know is highly contested by the government itself, indicated the long-run increase in GDP would be £2 billion a year, or 0.06% of GDP. Now, we're all, Mr Deputy Speaker, aware of the parable of the hare and the tortoise, but I'm not sure there's many tortoises could even live long enough to make sure that that ground was caught up on to replace what was left behind. But whatever benefits do arise, and at this point in time they look distant and minimal at best, they will always and forever be less than we could have had under different circumstances. Now, throughout the passage of the bill, along with others, I have sought to warn the government of the impacts, to find a way to quantify those impacts of the risks involved right across a range of sectors that will be affected by the CPTPP. And we will remain vigilant and hold the government to account for that where the outcomes justify. I suppose, not wishing to disturb the bonhomie that there's been, one big question remains as whether or not all the front benches will be reunited to discuss any further trade deals before the Prime Minister has to call an election. And on that, I await that with bated breath. Thank you.
The question is that the bill be now read the third time. As many of that say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to motion number 3 on companies. Minister to move.
I beg to move.
Question is as on the order papers. May I say aye? Aye. No. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to motion number 4 on terms and conditions of employment. Minister to move.
I beg to move.
Question is as on the order papers. May I say aye? Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to motion number 5 on energy. Minister to move.
I beg to move.
The question is as on the order papers. May I say aye? Aye. Or the contrary, no. The Right Honourable Lady for Suffolk Coastal has made her objection clear, but I will take it on the voices. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Motion number 6 on agriculture. Minister to move.
I beg to move.
Question is as on the order papers. May I say aye? Aye. No, I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Motion number